There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the world in the deep hours of the night, a hush that feels ancient, as though the darkness itself remembers something older than the cities and highways and electric lights that now fill our waking hours. It is in that silence, in the gentle drifting space between one breath and the next, that history becomes something more than facts and dates and the names of long-dead kings. It becomes a feeling, a warmth, a soft, slow tide of stories that carry you somewhere very far away, and yet somehow closer to the truth of what it means to be human than any headline or news cycle ever could. Tonight, that silence is not empty. If you close your eyes and let your breathing slow, you might begin to feel it. The faintest suggestion of cold salt air, the kind that comes off open water in the early morning hours before the sun has properly risen. There is the sound of timber shifting, the low rhythmic creak of wood against water, and beneath it all something older still, the sound of the sea itself, breathing in and out against a rocky coastline somewhere in the far north of the world. The sky above is immense and dark, pricked with more stars than most of us will ever see in our lifetimes. The kind of sky that makes the universe feel both impossibly vast and somehow, quietly, like home. This is where we begin tonight. Not in a museum, not in a textbook, not in the halls of some great university where scholars debate the precise dating of rune stones and the metallurgical composition of ancient swords. We begin, instead, at the water's edge, at the edge of a world that was younger, wilder, and in many ways more honestly itself than the world we inhabit today. We begin at the edge of the Viking Age, and we begin there gently, because the truth about the Vikings, who they really were, how they actually lived, what they believed, how they loved, what they feared, and what they built, is a story that deserves to be told slowly, with care, in the same unhurried way that the tides move along those ancient northern coasts. The word Viking carries so much weight. It arrives in the modern imagination trailing long shadows, images of enormous wild-haired warriors crashing ashore from dragon-prowed ships, horned helmets catching the firelight, their battle cries splitting the cold morning air. Hollywood has been enthusiastic in its depictions. Television has been generous with blood and spectacle. Video games have made heroes and monsters of them both. And there is something thrilling in all of that, something that speaks to a very deep and very human hunger for stories of bold action in a world that felt fully alive with consequence and danger. We do not begrudge the storytellers their drama, but the Vikings themselves, the actual men and women and children who lived and breathed and worked and loved and argued and laughed across roughly 3 centuries of Northern European history, from somewhere around the late 8th century through to the late 11th century. Those people were something rather more interesting than their popular image suggests. They were farmers and craftspeople. They were traders of extraordinary range and ambition. They were explorers who reached continents that the rest of the known world had no idea existed. They were poets of great sophistication. They were lawmakers. They were parents. They were believers in a rich and complex mythology that shaped every aspect of how they understood the world, from the thunderstorm rolling in off the sea to the frost that crept across the ground on winter mornings. They were human beings of remarkable depth and complexity, living at a particular moment in history when the world was changing very fast, and they, in their own way, were both agents of that change and people trying simply to survive within it. And they did not wear horned helmets. That last point will occupy us properly in a little while, but for now, let it simply settle into the air like a small, pleasant surprise. a reminder that the most interesting truths about history are so often the ones hiding just beneath the surface of what we think we already know. Let the sound of the sea continue beneath these words. Let the darkness be gentle. Somewhere in the imagined distance, a longhouse sits low against a hillside, its turf roof silvered by moonlight, smoke curling from the central hearth hole into the night air above. Inside, the fire is banked down to embers, and the household sleeps. The farmer and his wife, their children tangled together on a long sleeping bench, the thralls in their corner, the livestock in the attached byre whose warmth seeps through the shared wall and keeps the coldest nights bearable. Outside, the longship is drawn up on the beach, its prow pointing out toward a sea that has carried these people to places that would have seemed impossible to their grandparents. This is the world we are entering tonight. A world that is, in its own way, utterly foreign to us, built on different values, animated by different fears and different hopes, structured by different social rules and different relationships to land and sea and sky. And yet, in another way, it is deeply familiar, because the people who lived in that longhouse worried about whether the harvest would be good this year. They celebrated when a child was born healthy. They grieved when someone they loved died young. They told stories by firelight to make the long winter nights shorter. They laughed at things that were funny, and they sat in quietness when the weight of the world felt heavy, and they looked up at the same stars we're looking at now and wondered, in whatever language their wondering took, what all of this meant. That is the Viking world. Not a world of pure savagery, not a world of pure nobility either, but a world of people, fully and recognizably human, doing what people have always done in every age and every corner of the earth, living their lives as best they could, with whatever tools and beliefs and social structures their particular moment in history had provided them. We will spend a long, quiet, deeply satisfying time together tonight, exploring that world. We will move slowly through it, pausing to look at things carefully, to turn them over and examine them from every angle, to follow the threads of a story wherever they lead, not rushing, not hurrying toward any conclusion, but simply moving through the past the way you might move through a beautiful, unfamiliar landscape on a still day when there is nowhere to be and all the time in the world to simply look and listen and understand. So take a breath. Let your body settle a little more completely into wherever you are resting now. The night is long and the story is rich. We have everything we need. Let the cold northern sea breathe at the edges of your awareness. Let the smell of pine smoke drift through your thoughts, and let us begin. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Not with a charge, but with a slow walk along a moonlit shore somewhere in the north of the world a very long time ago. The Viking Age is conventionally dated from 793 CE, the year Norse raiders attack the monastery of Lindisfarne, a holy island off the northeast coast of England, shocking the Christian world with their sudden and violent arrival. That date is a useful starting point, though like all historical starting points it is somewhat arbitrary. The Norse people did not suddenly become Vikings on a particular morning in 793. They'd been building their ships and developing their seafaring skills and pushing further and further along the European coastlines for decades before that, and the social and cultural forces that would eventually produce the Viking Age had been quietly gathering for generations. But Lindisfarne is where history drew a sharp line, largely because the Christian monks who recorded events in their chronicles were understandably shaken by what had happened to them, and their accounts have shaped our understanding of those centuries ever since. The word Viking itself is worth pausing on, because it is widely misunderstood. In Old Norse, the language spoken across Scandinavia during this period, the word Vikinger referred specifically to a person who went on a raiding expedition. It described an activity, not an ethnicity or a cultural identity. A Norseman could go Viking the way a modern person might go hiking. It was something you did seasonally for a specific purpose, and then you came home and were a farmer or a craftsman or a merchant again. The vast majority of the people we now call Vikings spent most of their lives doing nothing remotely Viking-like in the Hollywood sense. They were people of the land and the sea, yes, but their relationship with both was far more complex and far more varied than the simple image of the marauding sea raider allows. The Norsemen and women of this period came primarily from what is now Norway, Sweden and Denmark, though the term also extends to Norse settlers in Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the eastern shores of North America. These were not a unified people with a central government or a shared political identity in the way we might think of a modern nation. They were a constellation of different groups with different regional traditions, different local leadership structures, different dialects and customs, connected by broadly shared language, shared mythological traditions, and a shared orientation toward the sea as both highway and livelihood. A Norse farmer in western Norway and a Norse trader operating along the rivers of what is now Russia might have recognized each other as speaking a mutually intelligible language and worshipping recognizably similar gods, but they would have had quite different daily lives and quite different immediate concerns. The geography of Scandinavia shaped everything. Norway in particular is a country of extraordinary natural drama, a coastline so fractured and folded by fjords that the actual length of the shoreline, if you measured every inlet and island, runs to tens of thousands of kilometers. Behind that coastline, mountains rise steeply, leaving only narrow strips of habitable land along the water's edge. This meant that in Norway, the sea was not merely an option, it was the road. You could not easily travel overland from one community to the next. You went by boat. You learned the sea not as an adventure, but as a necessity, the way children who grow up in cities learn to navigate their streets. The extraordinary seamanship for which the Norse people became famous was not some innate cultural gift. It was the product of generations of practical necessity, of learning to read water and weather and wind because your survival and your livelihood genuinely depended on it. Denmark, by contrast, is flat and well suited to agriculture, with easier overland connections and a position at the base of the Scandinavian peninsula that made it naturally a crossroads of trade. Swedish territory in this period included rich agricultural land, as well as access to major river systems that flowed south and east into what is now Russia, providing trade routes of staggering length and complexity. The Norse world was not one geography but many, and this diversity is part of what made the people of the Viking Age such varied and adaptable figures in the broader story of European history. But let us not move too fast. The night is young and the fire is warm and there is so much to explore. Let us begin where perhaps we should have always begun, not with the war cry or the ship's prow, but with the quiet truth about the helmet. Because if there is one thing almost everyone thinks they know about the Vikings, it is the thing they are most completely wrong about. And the story of how that misconception arose tells us something rather wonderful about how myths work and why they're so much harder to dislodge than facts. The horned helmet. It sits in the mind's eye with extraordinary confidence, as though it has always been there, as though it is simply part of the furniture of history, as natural and inevitable as the idea of Roman soldiers in red-plumed helmets or medieval knights in full plate armour. If someone says the word Viking, the horned helmet appears almost automatically, summoned by decades of cultural repetition so thorough that it feels like knowledge even when it isn't. Here, then, is the quiet, rather stunning truth. In all of the archaeological record of the Viking Age, across all the excavations and museum collections and painstaking scholarly research accumulated over more than a century of serious study of Norse history, there is precisely one well-preserved helmet that can be definitively dated to the Viking Age, and that helmet has no horns. One helmet, one, from the entire 3-century span of the Viking Age. This is the Geirmundbu helmet, found in a burial mound at Geirmundbu in Ringerike, Norway, in 1943. It is a remarkable object. A rounded iron skull cap with a protective spectacle guard around the eyes and nose, built from several iron plates riveted together in a style that appears across the broader Germanic and Frankish military tradition of the period. It is a helmet built by people who understood what combat actually demanded. It is practical, sturdy, and reasonably well suited to the task of protecting the human head from things trying to damage it. And it has no horns. Other fragments of Viking Age helmets have been found at various archaeological sites, and none of them feature horns either. Some scholars point to later medieval Scandinavian helmet types that may have had decorative elements, and there are a handful of small figurines and decorative objects from the Viking Age, and earlier that appear to depict figures wearing horned headgear. But these seem to represent ritual or ceremonial contexts, possible religious or theatrical uses, rather than combat equipment. The idea of going into battle wearing large curved horns projecting from your helmet is, when you think about it for just a moment, obviously impractical. The horns would catch on things. They would provide an opponent with something to grab. They would make the helmet dramatically heavier and less stable. Military equipment in every culture and every period evolves toward what actually works, and horned helmets simply do not work on a battlefield in any meaningful sense. So where did the idea come from? The honest answer requires us to step back from the Viking Age itself and take a brief journey through time, not forward, but sideways, into the world of Northern European mythology and archaeology, from periods considerably earlier than the Norse era. Horned helmets do exist in the archaeological record. They are simply not from the Viking Age. The most famous examples are the Vexur helmets, two remarkable bronze-horned helmets discovered in a Danish bog in 1942, dating to approximately 900 BCE, more than 1700 years before the Viking Age began. These helmets, with their elaborate curved horns and beautifully worked bronze surfaces, were clearly ceremonial objects of great prestige and significance. They may have been used in religious rituals or worn by figures of special authority during particular ceremonies. They were not combat equipment. But they are real, and they are genuinely ancient, and they belong to the same broadly Northern European cultural tradition that eventually produced the Norse people, even if they are separated from the Viking Age by an immense gulf of time. There are also various rock carvings and Bronze Age artworks from Scandinavia that depict figures wearing horned headgear, clearly in ritual or ceremonial contexts. These images float in the visual imagination of Northern European culture, occasionally resurfacing in various forms, contributing to a broader sense that horns and ancient Northern peoples simply belong together somehow. But the decisive moment in the creation of the horned Viking myth came considerably more recently than any of this. It came in the 19th century, that great age of romantic nationalism, when countries across Europe were busily constructing and celebrating their national identities through art, literature, music, and theatre. In Scandinavia, as elsewhere, there was enormous enthusiasm for the idea of noble ancient ancestors, powerful forebears whose heroism and wild freedom could serve as inspiration and legitimacy for the modern nation. The Norse past was an obvious source of this romantic material, and artists and writers threw themselves into its dramatization with tremendous enthusiasm. The costume designer Carl Emil Doepler created his famous horned helmets for the first performance of Richard Wagner's opera cycle Der Ring der Nibelung in 1876. Wagner's epic work drew on Germanic and Norse mythology, on the Nibelungenlied and the Norse Eddas, and Doepler's designs reached for visual grandeur and symbolic power. Horned helmets read as ancient, as dramatic, as properly mythological. They became the defining visual shorthand for the ancient Norse world in the popular imagination, and from there, through the extraordinary influence of Wagner's operas and the broader Romantic tradition, they spread into illustration, into early cinema, into theatre, into cartoons, into sporting mascots and Halloween costumes, until they became utterly inescapable. By the time serious archaeology began to establish what actual Viking Age helmets had looked like, the horned version had already taken up permanent residence in the popular mind. And myths, once established, are extraordinarily resistant to correction. They have a kind of emotional truth, a sense that this is simply how things should be, that makes facts feel somehow beside the point. The horned helmet felt right for the Vikings. It felt like the right kind of dramatic, wild, barbaric image for a people who occupied a particular position in the cultural imagination. The ferocious northerners, the chaos to Rome's order, the untamed wilderness pressing against the borders of the civilized world. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the story of the horned helmet is not just about a helmet. It is about how cultural narratives are constructed, how they serve particular purposes in particular moments, and how those narratives can then persist almost indefinitely, long after the purposes that created them have disappeared. The 19th century need for dramatic ancestral images produced the horned Viking. The 20th century's entertainment industries reproduced and amplified that image until it was effectively unkillable, and here we are in the early decades of the 21st century still having to explain that no, the Vikings did not actually wear horned helmets, to audiences who have spent their entire lives seeing precisely that image on screens and in books and in museums of the popular imagination. What did Norse warriors actually wear on their heads? The honest answer is that for most of the Viking Age, for most of the people involved in combat, the answer is probably not much or very little. Metal helmets were expensive and required skilled craftsmanship to produce. For the average Norse warrior, a farmer called up for local defence, a man on a raiding party who was not among the wealthy leadership, some kind of leather cap or padded cloth headgear was probably the norm. Perhaps a leather helmet reinforced with iron strips. Perhaps nothing at all beyond whatever courage and adrenaline could provide. Wealthier warriors, jarls and their senior retainers, experienced fighters who had accumulated both the means and the need for proper equipment, would have worn metal helmets of the practical, unfussy type, represented by the Geirmundbu example, round iron caps, sometimes with nasal guards, sometimes with the spectacle-type eye protection, built to function rather than to impress. Chainmail, known in Old Norse as brynja, was also used by those who could afford it, worn to protect the neck and shoulders. Shields were common, round wooden shields with iron bosses at the centre, which were the primary defensive equipment of the Norse warrior. The shield was not merely a passive defensive tool, it was actively used in combat to control distance and deflect blows. The overall picture of the well-equipped Norse warrior is, in truth, not dramatically different from the military equipment of other peoples of the same period. Franks, Saxons, early medieval Europeans generally. They shared broadly similar technological traditions, similar materials, similar approaches to the problem of how to protect a human body in close combat. The Norse were not exotic outliers in their military equipment. They were participants in a broader early medieval military culture, shaped by the same practical constraints and the same accumulated knowledge. The weapons of the Viking Age are somewhat better represented in the archaeological record than the armour, largely because swords and axes and spearheads are more durable objects and were often included in burial assemblages. The Norse sword of the Viking period was a beautiful and formidable weapon, typically a double-edged blade between 70 and 80 centimetres long, with a wide fuller running down the centre to reduce weight without compromising strength. These were weapons of considerable craft and value, often given personal names in the sagas: leg-biter, blood-drinker, gold-hilt, names that speak to the intimate relationship between a warrior and his weapon in a world where a good blade could make the difference between life and death. The axe tends to loom large in popular images of Viking warfare, and it was certainly used. Large, long-hafted axes capable of tremendous destructive force, as well as smaller hand axes that served both as combat tools and as practical multi-purpose implements in daily life. But the spear was probably the most common weapon of the ordinary Norse warrior, simply because it was cheaper to produce and required less skill to use effectively than a sword. A good spear, a long ash shaft tipped with an iron head, could be made by a competent blacksmith at modest cost and wielded to considerable effect even by someone with limited combat training. None of this is particularly romantic. It is rather the honest picture of a military culture that was practical, pragmatic, and shaped by the same economic and technological realities as every other military culture of its era. The Norse were effective fighters not because they were superhuman or innately savage, but because they were willing to raid, and because their ships gave them a strategic mobility that their opponents often found very difficult to counter. By the time an Anglo-Saxon or Frankish local defence force could be organised and assembled, the Norse raiders had often already done whatever they came to do, and were pulling back out to sea. Speed and surprise were the real tactical advantages, not horned helmets or divine berserker fury, though both of those ideas served various purposes in the stories people told afterward. The berserkers deserve a brief mention here, because they occupy an interesting space in the historical record. Old Norse sources do mention berserkir, warriors who fought in a state of wild, trance-like fury, seemingly impervious to pain and capable of extraordinary feats of violence. The word itself may derive from björn, meaning bear, suggesting warriors who wore bearskins or who sought to channel the spirit of the bear in battle. Some scholars have proposed that berserk rage may have been induced by particular plants. Flight agaric mushrooms have been suggested among other things, though this remains disputed. Others argue that the berserker state was a real psychological phenomenon, something close to what we might now recognize as combat-induced dissociation or adrenaline overload. Whatever its precise nature, the berserker was clearly a recognized figure in Norse culture, and the fearsome reputation of these fighters was real enough that their opponents noted it. But berserkers were a relatively small, specialized subset of Norse warriors, not the norm. The average Norse farmer who picked up a spear to join a local raiding party or defend his community was not going into battle in a state of supernatural fury. He was probably frightened, probably trying to stay close to the men he knew and trusted, probably hoping that the whole thing would be over quickly and that he would get home with his limbs intact. This is the universal experience of combat across all periods of history, and the Norse were not exempt from it simply because later storytellers chose to emphasize the exceptional rather than the ordinary. If the horned helmet is the most visually persistent Viking myth, it is far from the only one. The popular image of the Norse people is built from a surprisingly small set of ideas. Brutal raiders, godless barbarians, heavy drinkers, dirty savages that were largely created by their victims and enemies, amplified by centuries of cultural repetition, and have proven extraordinarily resistant to the considerable body of historical and archaeological evidence that complicates or contradicts them. It is worth remembering who wrote most of the primary sources about Viking Age Norse people. It was overwhelmingly Christian clerics and monks, the very people most likely to be the targets of Norse raids on the rich, undefended monasteries that dotted the coastlines and riverbanks of early medieval Europe. These writers were understandably not inclined toward charitable portrayals of the people who had ransacked their communities and killed their brothers. The image of the Norse as pagans and savages served very clear rhetorical purposes in a Christian literary tradition that understood the world through the lens of sacred and profane, civilized and barbarian, God's people and the enemies of God. The Norse, who did not worship the Christian God and who raided Christian holy places, were a natural fit for the role of the enemy. This is not to say that the Norse raids were gentle affairs or that the suffering they caused was not real. It was profoundly real. Lindisfarne and the dozens of monasteries attacked in the following decades were genuine catastrophes for the communities that experienced them. Books burned, treasures stolen, people killed or enslaved. The violence of the Viking Age was not a fiction created by biased sources, but the sources present that violence stripped of all context, stripped of the Norse perspective, stripped of the economic and social forces that drove raiding, stripped of the complex relationships between Norse and non-Norse peoples that developed over the same centuries and that tell a very different and much more nuanced story. The myth of the Norse as uniquely savage is particularly puzzling when you consider that the early medieval period in Europe was not exactly a time of general peacefulness among any of the populations involved. The Franks under Charlemagne conducted brutal military campaigns against the Saxons that included mass executions. The massacre of Verdun in 782, where Charlemagne ordered the beheading of 4,500 Saxon captives in a single day, is one of the most shocking acts of mass violence of the entire early medieval period. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fought among themselves with considerable ferocity. Local warlords across the European continent conducted raiding and violence against civilian populations on a more or less continuous basis. The Norse did not invent violence or raiding. They were participants in a broadly violent early medieval world. What made them distinctive was not the fact of violence, but rather the particular strategic advantages that their ships gave them, and the geographical range that those ships allowed. The myth that Vikings were exceptionally dirty is another persistent inversion of historical reality. The archaeological record tells a rather different story. Norse grave sites regularly include combs, typically made from antler or bone, as well as ear picks, tweezers, and other personal grooming implements. The Old Norse sagas speak repeatedly of bathing, and there is good evidence that the Norse had a bathing culture that was considerably more regular than that of many of their European contemporaries. The Icelandic sagas mention bathing so frequently and matter-of-factly that it is clearly understood as a routine part of life rather than an occasional luxury. Some accounts from foreign observers, including Arabic travellers who encountered Norse traders in the east, along the Volga trade routes, express surprise at how frequently the Norse bathed, though other observers noted behaviours they found less hygienic. The picture that emerges from careful analysis of all the available evidence is of a people with a generally practical approach to personal cleanliness, not by modern standards, of course, but quite comparable to or better than most of their European contemporaries. The image of the filthy, unwashed Viking is partly a product of the biased ecclesiastical sources already discussed, and partly of a later Victorian tendency to project contemporary ideas about cleanliness and civilization onto historical peoples in ways that conveniently confirmed existing hierarchies. The myth of the Viking as purely a raider and warrior, the idea that this is the essential truth of the Norse people, everything else being secondary or incidental, is perhaps the most damaging distortion of all, because it obscures the aspects of Norse civilization that are most interesting and most revealing. The Norse were, first and foremost, a farming people. Agriculture was the foundation of their economy and their society. The vast majority of Norse people, in the vast majority of their daily lives, were doing the same things that farming populations everywhere have always done: tending crops and livestock, managing their land, processing food, building and repairing their buildings, managing the complex social relationships of rural community life. Raiding was, for most people who participated in it, a seasonal activity undertaken for specific economic reasons, not the defining purpose of their existence. They were also traders of quite extraordinary ambition and sophistication. The Norse trading networks of the Viking Age stretched from the North Atlantic to the Middle East, from the cod fishing grounds off the coast of Newfoundland to the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. Norse traders, travelling the great river systems of Eastern Europe, brought furs, amber, honey, and enslaved people south and east in exchange for silver, silk, glass, and spices. The dirhams, Arabic silver coins, that turn up in Norse graves and hoards across Scandinavia testify to trade connections of breathtaking geographic scope. The Norse were not peripheral actors in the medieval economy. They were central players, and the wealth that funded their longships and their great hauls came as much from trade as from raiding. The myth that Vikings were universally worshippers of chaos and enemies of order is complicated enormously by the sophisticated legal culture that the Norse developed, most visibly in Iceland. The Althing, the Icelandic parliament established in 930 CE, is one of the oldest representative assemblies in the world. It met annually in the open air at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where the land itself is being slowly pulled apart by tectonic forces, and it functioned as the supreme judicial and legislative body of Iceland for centuries. Free men could bring disputes before the assembly for judgment. New laws could be proposed and debated. The society that produced the Althing was not a society of pure chaos and violence. It was a society with a sophisticated investment in the idea that disputes should be settled through process and argument rather than simply through force. The Norse legal tradition, preserved in the Icelandic law codes and in the sagas, reveals a society acutely preoccupied with honour, obligation, and the proper management of conflict. The concept of outlawry, being declared an outlaw and thereby placed outside the protection of society, was one of the most severe punishments available, more feared than many forms of physical violence, because it stripped a person of every social relationship and every legal protection simultaneously. The elaborate system of weregild, compensation payments for injury or death, represents an attempt to manage the cycles of vengeance that violence naturally produces by providing a financial alternative. These are not the institutions of a people for whom violence was simply the default response to every situation. The myth of the Norse as godless heathens, a characterization that comes almost entirely from Christian sources, also requires careful examination. The Norse were not without religion. They had an extraordinarily rich and complex religious life, centered on a sophisticated mythological tradition that addressed the same fundamental human questions that all religious systems address. How did the world come to be? What is the nature of the gods and their relationship with humanity? What happens after death? What obligations do humans have toward each other and toward the divine? The Norse pantheon, Odin, Thor, Freya, Tyr, Loki, and the many others, was not a simple collection of war deities designed to sanctify violence. It was a nuanced cosmological system in which the gods themselves struggled, made mistakes, experienced loss, and were subject to the same fate that awaited humans and gods alike. Ragnarok, the final doom of the universe. Odin, the chief of the gods, was not a simple war god, but a figure of profound complexity, a seeker of wisdom who sacrificed his eye for knowledge, who hung on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain the secrets of the runes, who was associated with poetry and sorcery and death as much as with battle. The Norse mythological tradition, preserved most fully in the Eddas compiled in Iceland in the 13th century, is a body of literature of genuine sophistication and beauty, and it tells us something important about the inner life of the people who created it. To understand the Viking Age, it is necessary and truly satisfying to step away from the dramatic episodes and the famous names and to enter the quiet, everyday world of the Norse household. This is where most of the people of the Viking Age actually lived most of their lives, and it is where the texture and reality of their civilization becomes most visible. The longhouse was the fundamental unit of Norse domestic life, a building that combined living space for the human household with space for livestock under one long roof, a pragmatic solution to the cold northern winters that also reflected a particular Norse sense of the household as a single community of humans and animals. Longhouses varied considerably in size depending on the wealth and status of the owner, but a typical example might be somewhere between 15 and 50 meters in length, with a width of about 5 to 7 meters. The walls were built from whatever materials were locally available: timber in forested areas, stone in places where good building timber was scarce, and turf in Iceland and Greenland where wood was rare. Turf longhouses in Iceland could be extraordinarily effective at retaining heat. The thick walls of piled sod provided excellent insulation against the brutal Icelandic winters. Inside, the longhouse was organized around a central hearth, a long fire pit running down the center of the main living space, providing heat, light, and the means for cooking. The smoke rose to escape through a hole in the roof, though it must also have distributed itself rather generously through the interior space, giving Norse longhouses the permanently smoky atmosphere that both preserved some of the organic materials found in archaeological excavations and gave the inhabitants a level of respiratory exposure that would alarm any modern health inspector. Around the central hearth, on either side, ran long benches, fixed platforms of earth or timber that served simultaneously as seating during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. Wealthier households would have had these benches padded with furs and textiles. Poorer ones might have made do with straw. The social hierarchy of the household was visible in its spatial organization. The high seat, the haseti, was positioned at the center of one of the long walls, facing the door, and this was where the head of the household sat. This seat was a position of real significance. It marked authority, and guests were greeted based on their status relative to the high seat, seated closer to or further from it according to their perceived importance. The high seat pillars, the posts on either side of the high seat, were objects of considerable ritual significance, and when Norse settlers emigrated to Iceland, the sagas tell us that they often brought their high seat pillars with them, throwing them into the sea as they approached the new land and taking the place where they washed ashore as an indication of where the gods wished them to settle. The Norse household produced most of what it needed through its own labour. Textile production, the spinning of wool and flax into yarn, the weaving of that yarn into cloth, was a constant and essential activity, largely carried out by women. Norse women of the Viking Age appear to have been responsible for textile production to a very significant degree, and the spindle whorl, the small weighted disc that balanced a spinning spindle, is one of the most commonly found artifacts in Norse settlements and graves of women. The volume of cloth required to clothe a household, to provide bedding and wall hangings, to make the sails of longships, which were also typically woven wool, was extraordinary, and the labour required to produce it was correspondingly enormous. Women in Viking Age Norse society occupied a social position that was, in several respects, more autonomous and legally recognised than that of women in contemporary Christian European societies. Norse women could own property, could inherit and manage land, could initiate divorce, a right that their contemporaries in most of Christian Europe decidedly did not have, and could participate in legal proceedings. The divorce provisions of Old Norse law are particularly striking in a medieval context. A woman could dissolve a marriage by summoning witnesses and formally declaring her intention to divorce in front of the couple's bed, then again at the door of the longhouse, then again at the assembly, a public declaration that freed her from the marriage and entitled her to reclaim her property. The grounds for divorce could include a husband's impotence, his habit of dressing in women's clothing, or simply his persistent failure to provide adequately for the household. This is not to romanticize the position of Norse women. Their lives were hard, their options were constrained by social convention and economic reality, and they operated within a deeply patriarchal framework in which men controlled most of the significant political and military power. But within that framework, Norse women had legal standing and social autonomy that was genuinely unusual for the period, and the archaeological evidence suggests that at least some women achieved positions of considerable prestige and authority. The burial known as the Oseberg ship burial, discovered in Norway in 1904, provides perhaps the most dramatic evidence of the high status that could be achieved by women in Viking Age Norse society. The burial contained a beautifully preserved Viking Age ship, one of the finest examples of Norse shipbuilding craftsmanship ever found, along with the remains of two women, one of whom was clearly buried with enormous ceremony and enormous wealth. The grave goods included elaborately carved wooden furniture, a richly decorated cart, 5 carved animal head posts whose purpose remains uncertain, textiles of extraordinary quality, kitchen equipment, agricultural tools, and much else besides. The identity of the women has never been established with certainty, but the richness of the burial speaks unmistakably to the high status that at least one of them held in life. There is also growing evidence from the sagas and from fragmentary historical records of Norse women who participated in combat, the legendary shield maidens, women warriors who appear in various texts and who have generated considerable debate among historians about the degree to which they represent historical reality versus literary or mythological elaboration. A burial discovered at Birka in Sweden, and long assumed to be that of a male warrior, was revealed through DNA analysis in 2017 to be that of a woman, buried with a full complement of weapons and 2 horses. The implications of this find are still being debated, but it adds at least one concrete data point to the question of whether some Norse women participated in military activities. Children in Viking Age. Norse society lived lives that moved fairly quickly from infancy toward adult responsibility. There is archaeological evidence of toys, small carved wooden animals, play weapons, miniature household objects, suggesting that childhood was recognized as a distinct phase with its own activities and pleasures. But children were expected to begin contributing to household work from a relatively young age, learning the skills they would need as adults. Boys learned farming and animal husbandry, the handling of boats if they lived in a coastal community, basic weapon skills. Girls learned spinning and weaving, cooking and food preservation, the management of the household stores and resources. Education in the formal sense did not exist in the way we understand it. There were no schools, no written curricula, but the transmission of knowledge happened through practice and through the oral tradition that was central to Norse culture. The Skalds, court poets of great sophistication, composed and recited elaborate poetry in intricate meters that required years of study to master. The mythological and heroic traditions were preserved and transmitted orally, memorized and recited by specialized practitioners. The runes, the writing system used by the Norse, were employed mainly for inscriptions on objects and memorials rather than for extended written texts, at least until the later Viking Age and post-Viking period. When contact with Christian literary culture began to change this, food in the Viking Age Norse world was varied, and, by the standards of early medieval Europe, reasonably nutritious. The staples were grain, primarily rye, barley and oats, dairy products, dried and smoked fish and meat, and vegetables including cabbages, onions, peas, and beans. Bread was baked in various forms, and porridge was a daily staple, filling and energy-providing if not particularly exciting. Meat, primarily lamb and goat, with cattle and pig depending on the region, was preserved through smoking, salting, and drying for consumption through the long winter months when fresh food was unavailable. Fish, particularly cod and herring, was enormously important in the Norse diet, both as a fresh food and as a preserved one. Stockfish, dried in the cold northern air until it was as hard as wood, could be kept for years and was a vital trade commodity as well as a dietary staple. The Norse drank ale, fermented grain beer, as their primary beverage, along with milk in various forms and, for those wealthy enough to trade for it, mead, the fermented honey drink that appears throughout the literature as the drink of feasting and celebration. The great mead hall of the sagas, a warm firelit space where the Jarl and his retainers sat and drank and listened to the skald and distributed rings to worthy followers, is one of the central images of Norse heroic culture, and while the reality was probably somewhat less romantically golden than the literary depictions, the basic institution of the communal hall as a centre of political and social life was real and important. The Norse year was organised around the seasons in ways that reflected both the agricultural rhythms of northern farming and the religious calendar. The great feasts of the Norse year included Yule, the midwinter festival that has bequeathed so many elements to the modern Christmas tradition, as well as seasonal celebrations associated with the beginning of spring ploughing, the harvest, and the period when the animals were brought in from summer pasture. These were occasions for communal eating, drinking, ritual observance, and the performance of the social bonds that held communities together. They were also occasions for the kinds of exchanges, of gifts, of hospitality, of pledges, that structured Norse social and political relationships. The concept of hospitality, taking in travellers, feeding guests, providing shelter, was deeply embedded in Norse culture both as a social obligation and as a religious value. The Havamal, the Sayings of the High One, a collection of wisdom poetry attributed to Odin, is full of advice about proper behaviour as both host and guest, reflecting a culture that understood the provision of hospitality as a moral duty. In a world without inns or formal accommodation systems, the willingness of households to take in travellers was literally a matter of life and death during the brutal northern winters, and the cultural weight placed on hospitality reflected this reality. The longship is perhaps the single greatest technological achievement of the Viking Age, the object that more than any other made the Norse world possible. It is worth spending some time with it, not rushing past it as mere background detail, but pausing to appreciate what an extraordinary thing it was and what it made possible for the people who built and sailed it. The Norse longship evolved over centuries, developing from earlier Scandinavian boat-building traditions into something that was, by the standards of the early medieval world, an almost miraculous piece of engineering. The longship's fundamental design principle was the clinker-built hull, overlapping strakes of carefully selected oak planks, each plank riveted to the next, creating a hull that was simultaneously lightweight, flexible, and extraordinarily strong. The flexibility was crucial. A longship did not fight the waves but moved with them, bending slightly as it rode through heavy seas in a way that distributed stress through the whole structure rather than concentrating it at weak points. Modern reconstructions and replicas have demonstrated that these vessels, built entirely without power tools or modern materials, could handle open ocean conditions that would be impressive for small wooden vessels even today. The longship was also extremely shallow in its draft. The depth of keel beneath the waterline was minimal, meaning the ship could operate in water so shallow that later, heavier medieval vessels would simply have run aground. This gave Norse sailors access to rivers and coastlines that were impassable to other vessels of comparable size, and it allowed them to beach their ships directly on open shores without needing ports or harbours. The ability to simply row up a river and then pull the ship out of the water onto the bank, turning it into an instant camp, gave the Norse a strategic flexibility that was genuinely unprecedented in early medieval warfare and exploration. The large ocean-going longships used for major expeditions could be impressive in scale. The largest known examples, based on archaeological finds, could be 30 metres or more in length, and capable of carrying 60 or 70 men plus their equipment. But the Norse also built smaller, more practical vessels for different purposes, cargo ships called nars, broader and deeper than the longships, designed to carry heavy loads of trade goods across the open sea, small rowing boats for fishing and coastal work, river boats adapted to the different conditions of inland waterways. The Norse maritime tradition was not built around a single vessel type, but around an entire ecosystem of boat designs adapted to different conditions and different purposes. The navigational skills required to use these vessels effectively were considerable. Norse navigators had no magnetic compass. That technology arrived in Europe from China during the later medieval period. They navigated primarily by observation of the sun and stars, by their knowledge of seabirds and sea creatures that indicated proximity to land, by the patterns of waves and swells that carried information about distant coastlines, and by the remarkable mental maps built up over generations of accumulated experience of particular routes. There is evidence that Norse navigators used a device sometimes called a solar compass, or sun compass, a bearing dial that, when combined with a shadow stick and knowledge of the sun's position at different times and latitudes, could provide useful directional information even in overcast conditions. The Norse sagas also mention something called a solarstein, a sunstone, whose precise nature has been debated. Some researchers have suggested it may have been a birefringent crystal like Iceland spar, which can indicate the sun's position even through cloud cover by polarizing light. The raiding expeditions for which the Norse are most famous were, from a Norse economic perspective, a fairly rational response to a set of specific conditions. The agricultural productivity of Scandinavia, particularly in Norway with its limited arable land, could not reliably support the entire population at acceptable living standards. The tradition of partible inheritance, dividing property among multiple sons, meant that younger sons in particular often found themselves with insufficient land to establish themselves as independent farmers. Meanwhile, the rich monasteries and trading towns of Western Europe represented concentrations of portable wealth, precious metals, fine textiles, coin, that were, from a Norse raider's perspective, relatively lightly defended and conveniently close to the water. The first Norse raids on the British Isles and the Frankish coast were probably small, opportunistic affairs. A few ships, a quick strike on an undefended target, and a rapid retreat before any organised response could be mounted. The success of these early expeditions encouraged more ambitious ones, and as the scale of raiding grew, the organisational capacity to carry it out grew with it. By the mid-9th century, large Norse fleets were wintering on islands in major rivers, the Seine, the Thames, the Shannon, using these as bases for extended campaigns that ranged deep into the interior of kingdoms that had had no previous experience of this kind of threat. The sack of Paris in 845 CE, when a Norse fleet of roughly 700 ships and up to 5,000 men sailed up the Seine and besieged the city, is perhaps the most dramatic single episode of the raiding period. King Charles the Bald of West Francia ultimately paid a ransom of £7,000 of silver to make the Norse go away, a transaction that set a dangerous precedent and was repeated many times subsequently. The Norse learned that Christian kingdoms would pay to make them leave, and the kingdoms learned, eventually and painfully, that payment only encouraged more raids. This cycle of raid, ransom, and raid again went on for decades, with enormous consequences for the political and economic structures of Western Europe. But the raiding was only one aspect of Norse overseas activity, and in terms of its long-term historical significance, it may not even be the most important one. Norse settlement, the permanent occupation of new territories, had consequences that lasted far longer and went far deeper than any raid. Norse settlers established permanent colonies in the Scottish Islands, the Orkneys, the Shetlands, the Hebrides, in Ireland, where the city of Dublin was effectively a Norse foundation, in Normandy, where the Norse Rollo accepted baptism and French lands from the Frankish king in 911 CE, and whose descendants would eventually conquer England in 1066, and most dramatically of all in Iceland and Greenland, and eventually the eastern coast of North America. The settlement of Iceland, beginning around 870 CE, is one of the remarkable demographic events of early medieval history. Iceland was, as far as anyone can determine, completely uninhabited when Norse settlers arrived, a genuinely empty land waiting to be claimed. Within roughly 60 years of the first settlement, the main areas suitable for farming had been occupied, and a society of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 people had established itself on the island. The Icelandic settlers brought with them their language, their legal traditions, their livestock, their social structures, and their oral literary tradition, and on this remote North Atlantic island they created a society that preserved Norse culture in a particularly vivid and complete form. Iceland was also the launching point for further Western exploration. Around 985 CE, a man named Eric Thorvaldsson, known as Eric the Red, presumably for the colour of his hair or beard, was outlawed from Iceland for manslaughter and sailed west into unknown waters. He found Greenland, a land that was, in its southwestern fjords, actually capable of supporting farming, if only barely, and returned to Iceland to lead a colonising expedition. 2 Norse colonies were established in Greenland that survived for several centuries, maintaining contact with Iceland and Norway and engaging in trade, before eventually dying out sometime in the 15th century, victims of climate change, the shifting economics of the North Atlantic trade, and quite possibly conflict with the Inuit peoples who were moving southward through Greenland at the time. Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, sailed further west from Greenland around the year 1000 CE and reached the coast of North America, becoming, insofar as the historical record allows us to determine, the first European to set foot on the American continent, almost 500 years before Columbus. The Norse settlement at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, excavated from the 1960s onward, provides solid archaeological evidence of a Norse presence in North America and is currently the only confirmed Norse site on the continent, though the sagas describe a more extended and geographically varied Norse exploration of what they called Vinland, Markland, and Helluland, names that scholars have variably identified with different parts of the northeastern North American coast. The eastern expansion of the Norse into what is now Russia, Ukraine, and beyond is perhaps less familiar to Western audiences but was enormously consequential in its own right. Norse traders and adventurers moved east and south along the great rivers of what is now Russia, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, trading with local Slavic and Finnish populations, establishing fortified trading posts that would eventually become the cities of Novgorod and Kiev, and making contact with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. The Norse who settled in Russia became known as the Rus, a name whose precise etymology is still debated, but which is the root of the words Russia and Rossia. The Norse influence on the foundations of Russian state and culture is a complex and politically sensitive topic, but it is an undeniable part of the historical record. The trading networks that the Norse established through their eastern expansion were extraordinary. Furs from the northern forests, sable, marten, beaver, otter, were enormously valuable commodities in the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad, where the wealthy classes of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds were willing to pay impressive prices for the luxury goods that the cold northern forests produced. Amber from the Baltic coastlines was another Norse trade commodity of great value. Enslaved people, captured in raids on coastal communities, or acquired through trade with peoples further north and east, were also a significant part of the Norse trading portfolio, a fact that sits uncomfortably but honestly within the historical record. In exchange for these commodities, Norse traders brought home silver, particularly the dirhams of the Islamic world, which circulated so abundantly in Norse territories that Scandinavia became effectively integrated into the silver economy of the Islamic Caliphate. They also brought home silk, spices, glass, fine metalwork, and the cultural influences that came with exposure to the sophisticated urban civilizations of Byzantium and the Islamic world. The Norse were not isolated primitives cut off from the wider world. They were active, ambitious participants in a global trading system of remarkable reach and complexity. The Norse religious world was a deeply inhabited one, not in the abstract theological sense of much formal religion, but in the immediate intimate sense of a world in which the divine and the human overlapped constantly. The gods were not distant abstract entities hovering somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary life. They were present in the weather, in the harvest, in the health of livestock, in the success or failure of a voyage, in the patterns of luck that seem to follow some people and abandon others. To live in the Norse world was to live in a landscape thick with meaning, where every natural phenomenon had a divine story behind it, and every significant human action was entangled with the attention and the will of the gods. Odin, Old Norse Odin, stands at the head of the Norse pantheon, though head is perhaps the wrong metaphor for a god who was as much associated with wisdom and magic and death as with any obvious kind of authority. Odin was the All-Father, the god who had created humanity along with his brothers Vili and Ve by breathing life into two trees they found on a beach, the man called Ask, made from an ash tree, the woman called Embla, made from an elm. But Odin was also the god who had hung himself from the branches of the world tree Yggdrasil, that immense cosmic ash tree whose roots reached into 3 different worlds, for 9 days and 9 nights, spearing himself with his own spear in a voluntary sacrifice to gain the wisdom of the runes. He was the god who had given one of his eyes to the giant Mimir in exchange for a drink from the well of cosmic wisdom at the root of the world tree. He was the god who sent his ravens Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, out across the world each morning to bring him news of what was happening everywhere, and who worried each day that they would not return. This Odin, complex, hungry for knowledge, willing to sacrifice enormously for understanding, associated with poetry, and with death as much as with martial glory, is a far more interesting divine figure than the simple war god that popular culture sometimes reduces him to. The Norse respected Odin, and they also feared him, because he was a god who played long games that were not necessarily aligned with human interests, who gave gifts that sometimes turned out to be curses, and whose favour was not easily predicted. The great warriors and kings who claimed Odin's special attention were also marked for the particular fate that Odin required, death in battle, so that their souls could join the chosen dead in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where they would fight and feast until Ragnarok. Thor, Old Norse Thor, was in many ways the god the ordinary Norse person most fully relied upon. The son of Odin and the earth goddess Jörd, Thor was a deity of tremendous physical power, whose red beard and great hammer Mjolnir made him instantly recognizable in Norse iconography. Thor was the god of storms and thunder. His hammer blows were the thunder, the lightning was the sparks from Mjolnir's impact. But he was also a protector, a defender of the realm of gods and humans against the constant threat of the giants and other chaotic forces that pressed at the borders of the ordered world. Thor pendants, small hammer amulets worn as jewellery, are among the most common Norse religious objects found in the archaeological record, worn by Norse men and women in the way that Christian contemporaries wore crosses. Thor was approachable, reliable, and straightforwardly committed to the welfare of humanity. He lacked Odin's unsettling complexity, and was probably more genuinely beloved. Freyja, Old Norse Freyja, was the great goddess of the Norse world, a figure of extraordinary power and complexity who was associated with love, sexuality, fertility, war, death, magic, and the practice of Seder, a form of shamanic magic that occupied an ambiguous position in Norse culture, simultaneously highly valued and somewhat transgressive. Freyja was said to receive half of all who died in battle, claiming them for her Hall Folkvanger before Odin took his share for Valhalla. She wept tears of red gold for her missing husband Oda, and she wore the Brisingamen, a necklace of extraordinary beauty and power. She was also the mistress of Seder, the magic of transformation and fate reading that she had taught even to Odin himself. The practice of Seder is one of the more intriguing aspects of Norse religious life. It appears to have involved a practitioner, often a woman, called a völva or spakuna, entering a trance state in which she could perceive and interact with the hidden forces and patterns of fate, offering prophecy and magical assistance to communities that sought her out. The Völva who appears in the sagas is a travelling figure, moving from community to community and receiving hospitality in exchange for her services. She sat on a high platform during her practice, dressed in elaborate regalia including a distinctive staff and garments made from the skins of various animals, while members of the community sang special songs called Vadlokur to call the spirits she needed. This whole complex of practice, the trance, the spirit contact, the prophetic function, has obvious parallels with shamanistic traditions from across the circumpolar world, and may reflect very ancient religious practices that the Norse shared with other northern peoples. What is particularly interesting about Seder in the Norse context is the social complexity surrounding it. The practice of Seder was considered somewhat dishonourable for men, or at least it sat uneasily with the masculine identity that Norse culture strongly valorized. The word ergi, denoting a kind of passive, feminine, or otherwise transgressive masculine identity, was one of the worst insults that could be levelled at a Norseman, and practicing Seder carried some of this taint because of its association with femininity and with a form of magic that worked indirectly rather than through straightforward physical power. That Odin himself practiced Seder was acknowledged in the mythology, and it represents one of the ways in which that most complex of gods sat outside ordinary social categories. The Norse afterlife was not a single unified concept, but a collection of different possibilities that a person might encounter, depending on the circumstances of their death and their life. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was the most famous, Odin's great hall in Asgard, where warriors who had died in battle were brought by the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, to feast and fight until the final battle of Ragnarok. But Valhalla was not the only destination. Freya's Hall of Folkvanga received another portion of the battle dead. The goddess Hel presided over a realm of the same name, a cold, dim underworld where those who died of illness or old age went, a place that was not pleasant but was not explicitly torment either, simply a continuation of existence in a greyer, diminished form. The sea god Ran was said to draw drowned sailors down to her hall beneath the waves. The Norse attitude toward death and fate was shaped by the concept of weird, a word related to the Old English term of the same meaning, implying the fabric of what is destined, the inescapable pattern of events that has been woven for each person before their birth. The Norns, 3 female beings named Urda, Verdandi and Skuld, corresponding roughly to past, present and future, sat at the root of the world tree and wove or carved the fates of gods and humans alike. No one escaped the fate the Norns had appointed. Even Odin knew that he was fated to die at Ragnarok, swallowed by the great wolf Fenrir, and this knowledge did not paralyze him, but rather lent a particular quality to his endless, desperate acquisition of wisdom, a sense that even the all-knowing must prepare, must strive, must not sit still while fate approaches. This acceptance of fate, not passive resignation, but a kind of fierce determination to meet whatever came with dignity and courage, is a recurring theme in Norse literature, and is described by modern scholars as the distinctive quality of the Norse heroic ethos. The great heroes of the sagas do not expect to live forever. They expect to die, perhaps soon, and they measure their lives by the quality of how they met their deaths, rather than by any hope of escaping them. The phrase rendered in various translations as dying well, or a good death, a death that was faced without flinching, that was perhaps glorious, that would be worth a place in the Skald's poetry, was one of the highest things a Norse person could aspire to. The skalds themselves were important figures in Norse culture, court poets who composed elaborate verse in complex metres for the jarls and kings who were their patrons. Skaldic poetry is technically demanding to an extraordinary degree. The metres involve intricate patterns of alliteration and internal rhyme, and the vocabulary of skaldic verse included elaborate poetic periphrases called kennings, in which a simple noun like sword might be replaced with a multi-word poetic description, like wound serpent or blood snake or the fire of the battle. These kennings were one of the great art forms of the skaldic tradition, and composing new ones of particular elegance and aptness was a mark of poetic skill. The corpus of preserved skaldic verse, much of it quoted in the Icelandic sagas, represents one of the richest and most distinctive bodies of medieval European literature. The Icelandic sagas themselves, the great prose narratives written down primarily in the 13th and 14th centuries but preserving traditions and stories rooted in the Viking age, are one of the great literary treasures of the medieval world. The family sagas, known as the Íslendingasögur, tell stories of Icelandic families in the period of the settlement and the first generations afterward, stories of conflict and honour and vengeance and love, and the complex politics of a farming society in a new land. The King's sagas, the Konungasögur, narrate the histories of the Norse kings of Norway and other Scandinavian lands. The mythological and legendary sagas, the Fornaldar range further into the world of heroes and monsters and magical adventures. Together they constitute a body of literature of extraordinary richness and historical importance. The Eddas, the two collections of Norse mythological material known as the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, are the primary sources for Norse mythology in anything like a coherent form. The Poetic Edda, a collection of mythological and heroic poems preserved in a 13th century Icelandic manuscript, contains some of the most beautiful and haunting verse in the medieval Germanic tradition. The Prose Edda, written by the Icelandic scholar and chieftain Snorri Sturluson around 1220 CE, is a systematic account of Norse mythology and a handbook of skaldic poetic technique, written by a man of remarkable learning who was trying to preserve a tradition he could already see slipping away in the face of Christianization. Snorri Sturluson is himself one of the most fascinating figures of the medieval Norse world, an Icelandic chieftain of great political ambition and substantial literary genius who lived in the early 13th century, a period when Iceland was being drawn into conflict with the Norwegian crown, and its political structures were beginning to break down. Snorri travelled to Norway, participated in the politics of the Norwegian court, returned to Iceland with royal ambitions that ultimately brought him into dangerous opposition to the Norwegian king Haakon IV, and was eventually killed in his own home in 1241, stabbed in his cellar, the sagas say, in a political murder that ended one of the most important intellectual lives of medieval Scandinavia. He left behind the Prose Edda and the Heimskringla, a great history of the Norse kings, works without which our knowledge of Norse mythology and history would be enormously impoverished. The Norse relationship with the Christian world was complex and evolved over the 3 centuries of the Viking Age. The earliest Norse raids on Christian targets were motivated partly by the wealth concentrated in monasteries, and partly by the simple fact that monasteries were lightly defended and conveniently located near the water. The Norse raiders of the early period appear to have had no particular animus toward Christianity as a religion. They simply did not share its prohibition on raiding the property of religious institutions. Over time, however, the relationship became more complicated. As Norse people came into sustained contact with Christian communities through trade and settlement, as Norse rulers began to understand the political advantages of conversion, and as Christian missionaries made deliberate efforts to reach Norse communities. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity was a gradual process that proceeded differently and at different paces in different regions. Norway's conversion is traditionally associated with King Olaf Haraldsson, who ruled from 1015 to 1028 CE, and who pursued Christianization with considerable enthusiasm and rather less restraint. Christian missionaries could be persuasive and patient, but a determined Norse king with an army was also persuasive, if somewhat more immediately. Olaf was killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 CE, in a battle against his own subjects and Norwegian nobles allied with the Danish king Knut, but he was subsequently recognized as a saint, Saint Olaf, and became the patron saint of Norway. Denmark converted somewhat earlier, during the reign of Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century. Harald's famous runic inscription at Jelling describes him as the man who made the Danes Christian. Sweden was the last of the major Scandinavian kingdoms to convert, with Christianity not firmly established there until the late 11th and early 12th centuries. Iceland presents a particularly interesting case because its conversion was decided by a political process rather than by royal decree alone. At the Althing of 1000 CE, after considerable tension between the Christian and pagan factions in Icelandic society, the law speaker Thorgeir Ljósvetningagoði, himself still a pagan at the time, was tasked with making a decision that could keep the peace. He spent a day and a night under his cloak, presumably deliberating, and then announced his judgment. Iceland would become Christian. The pagan temples and public sacrifice would cease. Pagans might continue to practice privately if they chose, but publicly the country would be Christian. This pragmatic, negotiated conversion, avoiding the violence that had accompanied conversion elsewhere, was a distinctly Icelandic solution to the problem, and characteristic of the Icelandic commitment to legal process over force. The Norse burial traditions of the Viking Age reflected both their religious beliefs and their social stratifications, and they have provided archaeology with some of its most dramatic and illuminating material from the period. The treatment of the dead varied considerably based on both regional tradition and individual circumstances, but the most spectacular Viking Age burials involved the interment of the deceased with their most valuable possessions, the things they would need in whatever existence followed death, sometimes in or beneath a ship, and sometimes accompanied by the sacrifice of animals and in some cases humans. Ship burials, in which the deceased was placed in an actual vessel, surrounded by grave goods, and then buried under a mound of earth, represent one of the most distinctive Norse mortuary practices. The Osberg ship burial already mentioned is the most elaborate surviving example, but the Gokstad burial, also in Norway, and the Vendel and Valskerd burials in Sweden represent others of great archaeological importance. The ships used in these burials were not old, worn-out vessels discarded at the end of their useful lives, but fine, well-built craft that were deliberately sacrificed as part of the burial ceremony, a statement about the status of the deceased and the wealth of the community that could afford to bury such an object. Cremation was also common in the Viking Age, particularly in Norway and Sweden, and cremation burials present their own archaeological challenges since the burning of organic materials destroys much of what might otherwise be preserved. But even cremation burials often included identifiable fragments of burned metal, weapons, jewellery, tools, that can provide information about the status and activities of the deceased. Some burial sites contain evidence of both practices at different periods or in different parts of the same cemetery, suggesting that the choice of cremation versus inhumation was influenced by individual preference or family tradition rather than a single universal norm. The rune stones, large standing stones carved with runic inscriptions, often commemorating individuals who had died or who had performed some notable deed, represent one of the most visible aspects of the Norse material legacy. Thousands of runestones survive, concentrated particularly in Sweden, where the runestone tradition was most vigorous in the late Viking Age and early Christian period. These inscriptions, while often formulaic in their language, provide invaluable information about personal names, family relationships, professional activities, and the fate of individuals who travelled abroad and did not return. Many runestones commemorate men who died on expeditions to England, the Byzantine Empire, or various other places, providing a direct window into the human cost of the long-distance enterprises that defined the Viking Age. The famous Jelling stones in Denmark, 2 runestones erected by the Danish kings Gorm the Old and Harald Bluetooth respectively, represent the political use of runic inscription at its most elaborate. Harald's stone, sometimes called the birth certificate of Denmark, depicts Christ in a style influenced by Byzantine iconography, alongside images of a serpent and a great beast, a fascinating fusion of Christian and Norse visual traditions at the moment of conversion. These stones were not simply memorials but statements of political and religious authority, declarations carved in stone and placed at a sacred site for all to see. Norse craftsmanship extended far beyond the spectacular longship and the runic inscription. The metalwork of the Viking Age in gold, silver, bronze and iron was produced to extremely high standards by craftsmen who had developed sophisticated techniques for working with precious metals. The jewellery found in Norse graves and hoards includes arm rings, neck rings, brooches of intricate design, pendants, and dress pins made with skill and artistry that needs no apology from modern standards of craft. The great silver hoards found across Scandinavia and in Norse settlement areas, collections of silver objects and coins buried for safekeeping and never reclaimed, reflect both the wealth that Norse trading and raiding generated and the precariousness of life in a world where burying your valuables was a sensible insurance policy. The Mammon style, the Ringerike style, the Urn style, these are the names given by art historians to successive phases of Norse decorative art during the Viking Age, each characterized by distinctive animal imagery, interlaced patterns, and plant motifs worked into elaborate compositions that decorated everything from jewellery to wooden furniture to weapon hilts to the carved prows of ships. The Ernstave Church in Norway, which has given its name to the final great style of Norse decorative art, preserves exquisite carved panels that demonstrate the extraordinary continuity between the pagan Viking Age artistic tradition and the early Christian period that followed it. The forms are the same, only the context has shifted. The Norse approach to trade, particularly in the East, deserves closer attention than it often receives. The Varangian trade routes, the network of river paths connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian, were among the most commercially important corridors of the early medieval world, and the Norse role in establishing and maintaining them was central. The town of Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, was one of the great trading emporia of the Viking Age, a cosmopolitan market town where Norse traders met Frankish merchants, Slavic traders, Finnish hunters and trappers, Byzantine agents, and Islamic merchants in a context of commercial exchange that required and produced considerable tolerance and flexibility. The Arabic traveller Ibn Fadlan, who encountered a group of Norse merchants on the Volga River in 922 CE, left one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of Norse people from an outside perspective. His account is often cited for its dramatic description of a Norse ship funeral he observed on the Volga, an elaborate cremation ceremony, involving the sacrifice of a slave woman who was to accompany her deceased master, but it also contains detailed observations of the physical appearance of the Norsemen he met, their habits of washing and cleanliness, their dress, their commercial practices, and their social customs. His account is that of a sophisticated urban man of a very different culture, encountering these northern traders with a mixture of fascination and anthropological distance, and it provides a perspective on the Norse that differs valuably from the ecclesiastical sources of Western Europe. Ibn Fadlan describes the Norse merchants he met as tall, fair-haired men of fine physical appearance, wearing cloaks that left one arm bare, carrying axes, swords, and knives at all times, their bodies elaborately tattooed from fingernail to neck with dark blue markings in patterns that he could not quite make out. They kept slaves, he noted, and the slave women served sexual purposes for their masters and all the men of the company without apparent restriction. They performed ritual worship at wooden posts carved with human faces that represented their gods. They were, in his description, simultaneously physically impressive and by his Islamic standards rather shocking in their lack of conventional modesty around bodily functions and their casual attitude toward religious observance. This is, of course, a single observer's partial account, filtered through the particular concerns and assumptions of his own cultural background. But it is invaluable precisely because of its outside perspective, a reminder that the Norse appeared, to those who encountered them from different cultures, as something specific and recognizable, people with a particular set of physical and behavioral characteristics, a particular style of dress and adornment, a particular approach to the world. The Norse presence in the British Isles deserves particular attention, because it was both intense and long-lasting, and because its consequences for the cultures of Britain and Ireland were profound and are still visible today. Norse raids on the British Isles began in the 790s with the attack on Lindisfarne, and they continued with increasing frequency and scale through the early 9th century. But from the mid-9th century onward, raiding increasingly gave way to settlement. Norse settlers occupied large parts of what is now eastern and northern England, the area that became known as the Danelaw, roughly the territory north and east of the line from London to Chester, where Danish law and custom held sway. York, known to the Norse as Jorvik, became the capital of a Norse kingdom in England and a major commercial centre that archaeological excavations in the 1970s and 1980s revealed to have been a densely populated, thriving urban environment with a rich material culture. The Norse impact on the English language is one of the most tangible and permanent legacies of this period. Hundreds of everyday English words derive from Old Norse, words so fundamental to the language that we use them without ever thinking about their origins. The words sky, skin, skirt, skull. The words they, them, their, the third-person plural pronouns of English, which replace the Old English equivalents under Norse influence. The words egg, knife, husband, window, anger, birth, cake, die, fog, gate, get, give, ill, law, leg, lift, odd, raise, root, run, same, seat, take, trust, wake, want, weak. These are not exotic borrowings from a foreign language. They are the basic vocabulary of everyday English life, embedded in the language through the centuries of close Norse-English contact in northern and eastern England. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 under William the Conqueror were themselves descendants of Norse settlers who had established themselves in northern France. The Duchy of Normandy takes its name from the Northmen who settled there. William's great-great-great-grandfather was Rollo, the Norse leader who had been granted the land of Normandy by the Frankish king Charles the Simple in 911 CE in exchange for baptism and a promise to defend the region from further Norse raids. Within a couple of generations, the Norse settlers of Normandy had adopted the French language and the Christian religion, but they retained other Norse characteristics: their military organisation, their legal traditions, their love of ships and the sea, that would shape the culture they brought to England in 1066. Ireland's experience of the Norse was similarly complex. The first Norse raids on Irish monasteries began in the 790s and continued for several decades with devastating effect on Irish ecclesiastical culture. But the Norse also established permanent settlements in Ireland that became important trading towns. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick all began as Norse foundations, and Dublin in particular became a significant commercial centre connected to the wider Norse trading world. The relationship between Norse settlers and the Irish kingdoms was complex and shifting, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, often both simultaneously. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 CE, traditionally portrayed as a decisive Irish victory over the Norse led by the High King Brian Boru, was actually considerably more complicated in its factions, with Norse fighting on both sides, and with the Irish victory producing more political fragmentation than unified triumph. The Norse experience in Russia, the foundation of what would become one of the most significant political entities of the medieval and modern world, deserves more sustained attention than it usually receives in histories of the Viking Age focused on Western Europe. The Rus, the Norse traders and adventurers who pushed east and south through the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine, established trading posts and eventually polities at Novgorod and Kiev that became the nuclei of the early Russian state. The primary chronicle, the earliest Russian historical source, compiled at the Kiev-Pechersk-Lavra monastery in the early 12th century, records the legendary invitation extended by the Slavic and Finnic peoples of the region to the Norse. "Come and rule over us, since our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it." This story of the voluntary invitation, the calling of the Varangians, has been politically controversial in Russian historiography ever since, because of what it appears to say about the origins of Russian statehood. The Norse Rurik, according to the chronicle, accepted this invitation and became the founder of the Rurikid dynasty that would rule Russia for many centuries. The Norse who settled in Russia became relatively quickly assimilated into the local Slavic culture. They adopted Slavic names, spoke Slavic languages, embraced the Eastern Christianity that the Byzantine Empire had brought to the region, but they left behind a political and commercial infrastructure of lasting importance. The trade route between the Baltic and Constantinople, what the Norse called the road from the Varangians to the Greeks, was one of the most commercially significant corridors of the medieval world, and the cities established along its length were among the most prosperous of the early medieval period. At Constantinople itself, the Norse mercenaries who served in the personal guard of the Byzantine emperors, the Varangian Guard, achieved a particular fame and prestige. The Varangian Guard was an elite military unit composed primarily of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon mercenaries who served the Byzantine emperors from around 988 CE onward. They were celebrated for their ferocity in battle and for their personal loyalty to the emperor, loyalty that was valued precisely because, as foreigners with no local political connections or dynastic ambitions, they had no reason to betray their employer. The Guard served with distinction in Byzantine campaigns across the Mediterranean world, and individual Varangians left records of their service in the form of rune, inscriptions scratched into the marble balustrades of the Hagia Sophia, casual graffiti left by bored Norsemen standing guard duty in one of the great churches of the world. Harald Hardrada, Harald Sigurdsson, is perhaps the most dramatic individual example of the far-ranging ambition and remarkable careers that the Norse world produced during this period. Harold was born in Norway around 1015 CE, fought at the Battle of Stiklestad where King Olaf Haraldsson was killed, fled afterward to Russia where he served in the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, then travelled to Constantinople where he served in the Varangian Guard for several years, campaigning in Sicily, Bulgaria and Palestine. He accumulated both military experience and considerable wealth in Byzantine service, returned to Russia, and eventually made his way back to Scandinavia, where he became King of Norway in 1046 CE. In 1066 CE, the famous year, he invaded England, claiming the English crown, was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire by the English King Harold Godwinson, and was in the end the last of the great Viking Age kings in the traditional mould. Within days of Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy had landed in the south of England with his own army, and the world that had produced Harold Hardrada was about to give way to a different kind of medieval order. The Norse in North America, the Vinland settlements described in the Vinland sagas, present a fascinating case of exploration and attempted settlement that ultimately did not succeed in establishing a permanent presence, but that remains historically remarkable for what it represents. The two sagas that deal primarily with the Norse discovery and exploration of North America, the saga of the Greenlanders and Eric's saga, differ in various details but agree on the broad outlines. Leif Erikson sailed from Greenland, reached a forested land with rich resources, spent a winter there, and returned with news of his discovery. Subsequent expeditions attempted to establish a permanent settlement, but encounters with the indigenous peoples of North America, whom the Norse called Skraelings, proved too difficult to manage, and the settlements were eventually abandoned. The site at Lonso Meadows in northern Newfoundland, discovered by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Annie Steiningstad in the 1960s, represents the only confirmed archaeological evidence of a Norse presence in North America. Excavations revealed the remains of several large buildings of distinctly Norse construction. Turf walls with timber frames of the type found in Greenland and Iceland, along with artifacts including a bronze ring-headed pin of Norse type, a soapstone spindle whorl, iron boat rivets, and iron slag from smelting, all datable to around 1000 CE. The site is almost certainly related to the Vinland expeditions described in the sagas, and while it may not be the main settlement they describe, it demonstrates conclusively that the Norse were in North America approximately 5 centuries before Columbus. What the Norse found in North America was extraordinary by their standards. Forests of a richness that Greenland and Iceland could not offer, wild grapes or berries that gave Vinland its name, rivers running with salmon, lands that seemed capable of supporting settlement. Why did they fail to establish a permanent colony? The sagas suggest that conflict with the indigenous population was the decisive factor. The Skraelings, initially somewhat wary but willing to trade, eventually became hostile when particular incidents. A panicking Norse bull that frightened them, a killing that escalated, tipped the relationship into violence. The Norse, whose numbers were small, and who were very far from any source of reinforcement, could not sustain a conflict with an indigenous population that was both numerous and on its home territory. They withdrew to Greenland and did not return in force. The Norse world was also a world of remarkable craft in wood, a perishable material that survives only in exceptional circumstances, which is why the wooden objects that have been preserved tend to be objects of great beauty that we regard almost with reverence. The carved wooden beds, sleighs, and furniture from the Oseberg burial, are extraordinary examples of Norse woodworking at its highest level. Surfaces covered in intricate animal carvings of the kind that would later develop into the great tradition of Norse decorative art. The whole made with tools that would be recognizable to any carpenter, but wielded with a skill and a vision that produced something unique and extraordinary. The stave churches of Norway, buildings constructed from vertical planks or staves using sophisticated joinery, represent the continuation of Norse wooden building tradition into the Christian period, and have survived in significant numbers precisely because they became sacred spaces that were carefully maintained. These buildings, of which about 28 survive in Norway today, preserve the techniques and in some cases the decorative elements of the Norse woodworking tradition in forms that can still be seen and touched and walked around. The dragon heads that decorate some of their roof lines are direct descendants of the ship prows of the longships, transplanted from sea to land, from the movement of water to the stillness of the sacred. The Norse impact on the mythology and literature of later European culture is difficult to overstate. The Norse mythological tradition, with its distinctive cosmology of the world tree, the realm of the gods, the giants and elves and dwarves, the great wolf and the world serpent and the trickster god who brought both gifts and disaster, entered the European cultural imagination and has never left it. J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a scholar of Old Norse and Old English as well as a novelist, drew heavily on the Norse tradition for the world-building of Middle-earth. The dwarves of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are recognisably drawn from the Norse tradition, as are many of the underlying mythological structures of his work. C.S. Lewis, Tolkien's friend and fellow Oxford scholar, was similarly deeply influenced by Norse mythology. Richard Wagner, as we have noted, drew on the Norse and Germanic tradition for Der Ring der Nibelungen. The days of the week in English, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, are named for Norse gods: Tyr, Odin, Woden, Thor, and Freya. The enduring fascination with the Norse world is not simply a product of the entertainment industry, though the entertainment industry has certainly amplified it. It reflects something genuine in the Norse legacy, the sense of a culture that was both alien and recognizable, both violent and sophisticated, both deeply rooted in its particular northern world and astonishingly well-travelled across the known and unknown world of its time. The Norse were sailors and poets, farmers and traders, raiders and lawmakers, believers in a mythology of breathtaking imaginative scope, and practitioners of a legal tradition of genuine sophistication. They were, in other words, exactly what human beings always are: complicated. The question of what happened to end the Viking Age is one that historians have approached from various angles. The conventional end date is usually given as 1066, the year of the Norman conquest of England and the death of Harold Hardrada, two events that together seem to mark the close of the era. But like the beginning of the Viking Age, its end was not a sudden event but a gradual transformation. The Norse world was Christianized, integrated into the broader European political and religious order, its distinctive maritime and raiding culture absorbed into the feudal structures that were spreading across the continent. The longships continued to be built, but their operators were increasingly integrated into the political systems of Christian Europe, rather than operating as mobile, independent forces that could strike and retreat beyond the reach of any kingdom's authority. The descendants of the Norse, the Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Icelanders, continued and developed the cultural traditions of the Viking Age in various ways. The sagas were written down in the 13th century, preserving the stories of the heroic age in literary form. The legal traditions of Iceland continued under Norwegian and then Danish overlordship, but retained much of their distinctive character. The seafaring tradition of Scandinavia continued. The Norse were among the best sailors in Europe throughout the medieval period and beyond, and the great tradition of Scandinavian maritime culture that produced the merchant fleets of the Hanseatic League, and, much later, the famous polar expeditions of Nansen and Amundsen and Shackleton's rescuer, is in some sense continuous with the longship tradition of the Viking Age. The runic writing system gradually gave way to the Latin alphabet as Christianization spread, but not before an enormous number of inscriptions had been made that preserve invaluable information about Norse language, culture, and history. The runes themselves did not disappear overnight. Some communities continued to use runic writing for certain purposes well into the medieval period, and there was a late flourishing of runic inscription in Dalarna in Sweden that continued into the 19th century. The runes carry a particular mystique in popular culture, an association with magic and mystery that has made them a persistent presence in fantasy literature and gaming, and this mystique has roots in their actual ancient use, since the Norse regarded the runes as more than simply a writing system, associating them with Odin's self-sacrifice and with a kind of inherent power. The Norse treatment of time deserves attention as well, because it reflects a cosmological worldview that was fundamentally different from the Christian linear model that was gradually replacing it. Norse cosmological time was cyclical and ultimately catastrophic. The universe had a beginning, yes, but it was moving toward a foreseen and inevitable end, Ragnarok, the doom of the gods and the destruction of the world as it existed. After Ragnarok, a new world would arise from the sea, fresh and green, and the surviving gods and the resurrected dead would meet again. This cycle of destruction and renewal, which has parallels in other mythological traditions, gave Norse culture a particular quality of tragic beauty, a sense that everything, even the gods themselves, was temporary, and that the appropriate response to this temporariness was not despair, but the fullest possible engagement with the time that remained. The twilight of the gods, Ragnarok, as described in the Völuspá, the great prophetic poem of the Poetic Edda, is one of the most extraordinary passages of Norse literature. The seeress who narrates the poem describes the unfolding of the final doom with a kind of terrible clarity. The breaking of cosmic bonds, the world-encircling serpent rising from the sea, the wolf Fenrir breaking free, the fire giant Surtur bringing flames that will consume the world, the gods falling one by one in individual combat with their destined enemies, Thor killing the world serpent Jörmungandr and dying from its venom, Odin swallowed by Fenrir, Fenrir killed by Odin's son Vidar. The whole great architecture of the Norse world, Yggdrasil, the Nine Worlds, the Hall of the Gods, undone in a final catastrophic encounter between the ordered world and the forces of chaos that had always pressed against it. And then, the new world, green and fresh, rising from the waters, a hall more beautiful than the sun standing on the mountain, the gods meeting again on the plain of Idavöla, finding in the grass the golden gaming pieces they had played with in the time before, the world beginning again. There is something very moving about this vision, seen from the long distance of 1,000 years. The Norse people who told these stories did not know, could not have known, that their own world was about to change so thoroughly that within a few generations the tradition that had produced these myths would be largely absorbed into the Christian framework that surrounded it. They told their stories of the end of things and the beginning of new things, and they lived their lives in the space between those stories, farming their difficult land and sailing their dangerous seas and building the longships and composing the poetry and raising the standing stones and burying their dead with the things they would need for whatever lay beyond. There is something that happens when you spend time with the real Vikings, not the horned helmet versions, not the Hollywood versions, but the actual human beings revealed by archaeology and sagas and careful historical research. And it is a kind of gentle, comfortable recognition. Not because the Norse world was like ours, it was profoundly different in almost every particular, but because the people in it were like us in the way that matters most, which is to say that they were fully people, navigating the same fundamental human experiences of love and loss and ambition and fear and wonder that we navigate today. The Norse farmer who stood at the edge of his field on an autumn evening and looked at the sky and felt the first cold edge in the air that meant the long winter was coming, the same feeling that the harvest was either good enough or not good enough, the same calculation about whether the stores would last, the same quiet prayer to whatever gods he believed in for the health of his family and the gentleness of the coming months. That feeling is not foreign to us. The warrior who sat awake in the night before a battle and felt afraid, and then resolved to be afraid and fight anyway, and then perhaps composed a poem in his head about it, because that was what his culture gave him as a way of holding difficult feelings. He is not foreign to us either. The Velva who travelled the winter roads from farm to farm, carrying her staff and her knowledge and her strange ability to stand at the edge between worlds and report back what she saw there, she is not foreign to us. What the Norse story offers us, when we hear it clearly and honestly, is a reminder of the extraordinary range of ways in which human beings have organized their lives and their societies and their understandings of the universe, and of the equally extraordinary continuities that persist across all of those variations. The Norse navigated by the stars. They understood the sea in their bones. They carved their history into stone and composed their philosophy into verse, and buried their dead with the things they loved. They built ships of breathtaking elegance and sailed them to the edges of the known world and beyond. They made laws and broke laws and argued endlessly about honor. They loved their children and their animals and their land. They were afraid of the dark and what might live in it, and they made gods to explain the thunder and the storm and the fate that approached every living thing from the moment of its birth. This is what we share with them. Not the violence, though violence is also part of the human story, and pretending otherwise does no one any favours. Not the specific myths, or the specific gods, or the specific legal code. What we share is the deep, persistent impulse to make meaning, to build community, to create beauty in the face of difficulty, to tell stories in the dark so that the dark feels less absolute. The Norse did these things with extraordinary skill and extraordinary energy, and the traces of what they built, in language, in literature, in place names, in the genes of the millions of people who carry Norse ancestry without knowing it, in the mythology that has woven itself so deeply into the cultural imagination of the modern world. Those traces are still with us, still alive, still part of the story we're all telling together. The night deepens around these words, and the imagined sea at the edges of this story breathes on in its slow, ancient rhythm. Somewhere in the long, quiet dark, the world tree stands at the centre of everything, its roots deep in the past, its branches reaching toward whatever is still to come. The ravens are out in the darkness, gathering information, carrying it back. The fires in the longhouses are banked down to embers. The household sleeps, and the real Vikings, not the myth but the people, rest in their mounds and their ships and their fields, in the ground of Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Iceland and Ireland and England and Russia and Normandy and every other place where they stopped and built something and left a mark on the world. Their stories survive. Their words are still with us, in the language we use every day, in the literature that grew from their literary tradition, in the mythological imagination that their stories helped to shape. They were farmers and warriors, traders and explorers, poets and lawmakers, believers and doubters, parents and children, people who were frightened and people who were brave, and, more often than not, people who were both simultaneously. They sailed into the unknown not because they were inhuman, but because they were fully human, driven by the same hungers and hopes and terrors that have always driven human beings toward the horizon. The stars over the northern sea are the same stars they navigated by. The waves that move against the Norwegian coast are the same waves that moved against it when the longships went out in the mornings of the Viking Age. The wind in the birch trees at the edge of an Icelandic farmstead carries something of the same cold clarity it carried 1,000 years ago. The world is still round and still enormous, and still full of things that have not yet been explored, and the human impulse to go out and find them, to push past the edge of what is known, to take the ship out past the last headland into open water, that impulse has not gone away. It lives in us still, that inheritance from the people of the north who looked at the sea and saw not an obstacle but a road, who looked at an empty horizon and saw not an end but a beginning, who told their stories by firelight, and then climbed into their ships and made those stories real on the open water of the world. The night settles more deeply now, and the story gathers itself towards silence, the way all good stories eventually do, not with a crash, but with a gradual, comfortable quieting, the way the embers in a good fire gradually dim without losing their warmth. Sleep gently. Dream of long ships on silver water, of firelight on carved wooden beams, of ravens circling above the mast as it cuts through cold northern air. Dream of the farmers and the poets and the traders and the explorers who made a world that was imperfect and sometimes violent, and always, in its most honest moments, recognizably human. Dream of the stars reflected in the fjords at night, of the silence that followed the last verse of the last scald, of the sound of the sea that has never stopped and never will. This has been a long, quiet journey through one of the most extraordinary chapters of human history, a chapter that is still being written, still being discovered, still being understood. The truth about the Vikings is richer and stranger and more human than the myth, and the truth, as it always does, rewards the patient and the curious who choose to seek it out, to truly understand what made the Norse world possible, what gave it its particular energy and its remarkable geographic reach. It is worth spending more time with the ships, not simply with the idea of them, not simply with the dramatic image of the dragon prow cutting through grey northern waves, but with the actual, practical, beautiful reality of what Norse shipbuilders made and what Norse sailors did with what they made. The keel of a longship was typically cut from a single long timber, a straight-grained oak of considerable length, chosen with care from whatever forest was available. The selection of timber was itself a skilled and important process. Not just any oak would do, and the Norse had a sophisticated understanding of which trees, cut at which time of year, in which conditions, would produce timber of the necessary quality. Boats and ships were built from green timber, freshly cut wood that had not yet dried, because the flexibility of green oak allowed it to be shaped and bent into the curves that the whole design required. As the vessel aged, the wood would dry and harden in place, setting into the shape it had been given. The strakes, the planks that form the hull, were not sawn but split along the grain of the wood using wedges and mallets. This radial splitting produced planks of much greater natural strength than sawn timber, because the wood's growth rings ran the length of the plank rather than being cut across. A split-riven plank might be only a centimetre or two thick, and yet have the strength to flex through heavy seas without breaking. The thinness of the planking was essential to the longship's performance. It kept the vessel light, and lightness was everything. A longship of 40 oars might weigh only around 20 tons when fully laden, compared to the much heavier Mediterranean galley designs of the same period. The overlapping strakes were caulked against water penetration using wool or animal hair soaked in pine tar, a technique that was both simple and remarkably effective. The pine tar itself was produced by slowly burning pine roots in a covered pit, a process that yielded a thick, dark, waterproofing substance of great durability. The Norse also treated their ships regularly with pine tar to preserve the wood and maintain the waterproofing. The smell of pine tar must have been one of the characteristic sensory experiences of any Norse harbour or boatyard. The sail, typically a large square sail of woven wool, dyed in bold geometric patterns, red and white being common combinations, was the longship's primary means of propulsion over any significant distance. Rowing was exhausting work, and could not be sustained for the long ocean crossings that Norse expeditions required. Under sail in a good wind, a longship was capable of remarkable speeds. Experiments with modern reconstructions have demonstrated sustained speeds of 10 to 15 knots in favourable conditions, and some claims from the sagas suggest even higher speeds in exceptional circumstances. The ability to cover 200 miles in a single day under good conditions was not beyond the capability of a well-found Norse vessel, which meant that distances that seemed daunting on a map could be covered in times that were surprisingly short by the standards of the period. The oars served for manoeuvring in harbours, for moving the ship when wind was unfavourable or absent, and for the final approach to shore in a raid when silence and speed needed to be precisely controlled. A longship's oarports were fitted with small wooden shutters that could be closed when the oars were shipped and the sail raised, preventing water from entering through the ports as the vessel heeled in the wind. These small details of practical engineering, the oarport shutters, the careful balancing of mast and ballast, the shaping of the keel to resist leeway when sailing across the wind, represent the accumulated knowledge of generations of practical seamanship, solutions to real problems worked out over centuries of building and sailing in northern waters. The longship's prow was often carved into the shape of an animal head, most famously a dragon or serpent, but also other creatures including horses and bulls and fantastical beasts. These figureheads were not merely decorative, they had a specific function in Norse belief, which was to intimidate enemies and to protect the crew from malevolent spirits encountered along the way. Some Norse laws, including the laws of Iceland, actually required that ships approaching harbour lower their figureheads before coming into port, so as not to disturb or frighten the land spirits, the landvetter, who protected Iceland. This small legal detail tells us something interesting about the intersection of practical seamanship, ritual belief, and legal regulation in Norse culture. Norse women and their world. The lives of Norse women in the Viking Age are a subject of growing scholarly attention, and what is emerging from that attention is a picture that challenges many of the assumptions that earlier generations of historians brought to the material. The women of the Norse world were not simply background figures, wives and mothers waiting quietly while their men went off to sea, but active, capable, and in some cases remarkably powerful participants in the full range of Norse social and economic life. The management of the household, the economy of the longhouse and its associated farm, was emphatically women's work, and it was work of real complexity and responsibility. The woman who ran a Norse household managed the food stores that would see the family through the winter months, making decisions about how much to allocate for daily consumption, how much to keep in reserve, when to slaughter animals whose feed would cost more than their eventual meat value, how to preserve the summer's abundance in forms that would remain usable through the cold, dark months. A serious miscalculation in any of these areas could mean hunger or worse before the spring came. The household keys, literal keys to the locked storage areas where valuable provisions were kept, were a symbol of the Norse woman's household authority, and they appear regularly in female burials as significant grave goods. The chatelaine, the woman who held the keys, had genuine economic power within the household, power that was recognized and protected by Norse law. The household's movable goods and food stores were in her care and her management, and theft from a locked store was treated differently, more seriously, than theft from an unlocked one, because it violated the space specifically under the chatelaine's protection. Textile production, as noted earlier, occupied an enormous portion of a Norse woman's working time, but this was not merely domestic drudgery. It was skilled, technically demanding work that produced goods of real economic value. The production of ship sails alone required staggering quantities of wool and an enormous investment of labour. A single sail for a large longship might require the annual wool clip of several hundred sheep and many thousands of hours of spinning and weaving. The women who produced these sails were not peripheral to the Norse maritime enterprise. They were central to it. Without their labour, the longships went nowhere. The völva, the seafarers, has already been mentioned in connection with the practice of seder, but she deserves more extended attention as a figure who occupied a unique social position. The völva was both valued and somewhat set apart from normal social categories. She moved through the society rather than being anchored to a particular household. She possessed knowledge and abilities that others did not, and she commanded a respect that was tinged with something like fear. The elaborate ceremonial context of her practice, the high seat, the special songs, the ritual garments, marked her as a figure apart, someone who operated at the boundary between the everyday world and whatever lay beyond it. The Eddic poem Völuspá, the seeress's prophecy, is narrated by a völva summoned by Odin to tell him the history and fate of the cosmos. The poem opens with the völva demanding attention from all assembled, from gods and men both, before beginning her recitation of cosmological history from the very beginning. The void before creation, the separation of fire and ice, the gathering of the gods in their primordial assembly, the creation of the world and the first human beings, and then the long, slow unfolding of cosmic history toward the inevitable doom of Ragnarok. It is a poem of extraordinary scope and power, and its narrator, a female figure of ancient wisdom, operating outside normal social structures, capable of seeing what the gods themselves cannot, tells us something important about the place of women in Norse mythological imagination, even if not necessarily in Norse everyday life. Female warriors, the shield maidens of Norse tradition, appear in the sagas and in later legendary material with enough consistency to suggest that the concept was at least culturally imaginable, even if the historical reality is debated. The mythological Valkyries, the divine warrior women who chose the slain on battlefields and carried them to Valhalla, represent one version of this tradition. The legendary shield maidens of the Fornaldarsoga, the legendary sagas, represent another, more quasi-historical version. and the Birka warrior burial already mentioned represents a potential archaeological data point, though the interpretation of that burial continues to be debated among specialists. What can be said with some confidence is that Norse culture did not as firmly exclude women from the martial sphere as, for example, the chivalric culture of later medieval Christian Europe tended to do. The cultural imagination of the Norse world could encompass the warrior woman as a recognized type, even if such women were clearly unusual. The legal position of the Norse woman gave her the right to bear arms for her own defense, and the practical reality of life in Norse settlements, particularly in Iceland, where farms were isolated and the master might be away for extended periods, may have required women to develop defensive capabilities that women in more settled, protected environments did not need. The role of women in Norse religion also deserves attention beyond the figure of the vulva. The great goddess Freya was perhaps the most widely worshipped of the Norse deities in the ordinary life of the community, more immediately approachable than the complex and somewhat frightening Odin, less narrowly specialized than Thor. Freya's association with love and fertility made her the natural object of prayer for those seeking partners or children, and her association with magic and fate made her relevant to anyone facing an uncertain future. Female figures associated with particular places, the Disir, ancestral female spirits connected to family and household, were also widely propitiated, particularly at the winter festival of Disablot, when offerings were made to secure their protection for the coming year. The Norse East, Varangians and Russia. The eastern dimension of Norse activity during the Viking Age deserves sustained attention as one of the most consequential and least well-known aspects of the Norse story in popular history. While the raids on Lindisfarne and the settlement of Normandy and the discovery of America capture most of the dramatic attention in Western treatments of the Vikings, the Norse movement into Eastern Europe was in many ways just as significant in its long-term historical consequences. The great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, the Dvina, flow south from the vast flat forested interior of what is now Russia toward the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and beyond. These rivers were, for the Norse traders and adventurers who began pushing into them from the late 8th century onward, natural highways leading toward the fabulously wealthy civilizations of Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate. The Norse who worked these routes were called the Rus, a word that most scholars believe derives from a Finnish term for the Norse, rutsi, itself perhaps connected to an Old Norse word for rowing men. The Rus gave their name ultimately to Russia itself, one of the more striking examples of how thoroughly the Norse had become embedded in the foundation of Eastern European history. The trade conducted along these eastern routes was substantial and sophisticated. The Norse brought from the north furs of exceptional quality, sable, Arctic fox, beaver, that were among the most luxurious and expensive commodities in the medieval world economy. They brought amber from the Baltic coastlines, a semi-precious material valued throughout the ancient and medieval world for its beauty and its supposed magical properties. They brought beeswax, used extensively in candle making for churches and palaces. They brought dried fish, and most controversially they brought enslaved people, men, women and children captured in raids on coastal communities across northern and eastern Europe, and traded south to the markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, where enslaved labour was in continuous and heavy demand. The slave trade conducted by Norse and other northern European traders along these eastern routes was a significant part of the medieval economy, though it tends to be underemphasized in popular accounts of the Viking Age that prefer to focus on other aspects of Norse activity. The Arabic word for a white European enslaved person, sakaliba, was applied broadly to Slavic and other northern European captives and reflects the volume and visibility of this trade in the markets of the Islamic world. The impact of this slave raiding on the communities that suffered it was severe. It contributed significantly to the depopulation and destabilization of communities across the Baltic region and Eastern Europe, and it sits as an uncomfortable but historically necessary part of the complete Norse story. In exchange for their exports, the Norse traders brought back from the East silver above all else, enormous quantities of it, in the form of Islamic dirhams that became the primary currency of North Scandinavia. The scale of the silver imports was staggering. Archaeologists have recovered literally hundreds of thousands of Islamic dirhams from Viking Age deposits across Scandinavia, representing a trade of truly vast proportions. This silver funded the Norse economy, enabled the construction of ships and the payment of warriors, and the creation of the great silver jewellery and metalwork that is one of the most distinctive material legacies of the Viking Age. The Norse also brought back silk, Chinese silk produced in the workshops of the Tang and later Song dynasties, that travelled the Silk Road to the Islamic world and then north through the Caspian and Volga routes to the Norse traders who carried it back to Scandinavia. Fragments of silk have been found in Norse graves from Sweden to Iceland, sometimes in context suggesting that silk was used as a prestigious textile, even for relatively modest purposes. Silk ribbons woven into tablet-woven bands, silk thread used in embroidery, silk patches used to decorate woolen garments. The presence of Chinese silk in a Norse grave in Birka or Hedeby is a testament to the extraordinary length and complexity of the medieval world's trading networks. The Norse establishment at what would become Novgorod, one of the great cities of medieval Russia, began as a fortified trading post somewhere in the early 9th century. The name Novgorod means new town, suggesting that there was an earlier settlement on the site, possibly a Norse trading post that was later regularized and expanded. Novgorod was ideally situated at the northern end of the river system connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea, and it became a major commercial centre where Norse traders met the Slavic, Finnic, and later Baltic peoples, who were their primary sources of furs and other northern commodities. Kiev, at the southern end of the Dnieper route, became the other great centre of the emerging Rus state. The account in the primary chronicle of how Oleg, a Norse leader, probably a successor of the legendary Rurik, captured Kiev around 882 CE and made it his capital is one of the foundational stories of Russian history. Oleg is said to have declared that Kiev would be the mother of Russian cities, a prophecy that proved remarkably accurate as the city developed over the following centuries into one of the major urban centres of medieval Europe. The Rurikid dynasty that Oleg helped to establish ruled Russia in various forms until the death of Fyodor I in 1598, a span of over 700 years. The relationship between the Norse Rus and the Byzantine Empire to their south was one of the defining relationships of the early medieval period in Eastern Europe. Byzantium, the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, centred on Constantinople, the city built by Constantine on the Bosphorus, was in the 9th and 10th centuries one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated states in the world. Constantinople was a city of perhaps 500,000 people, vastly larger than any city in Western or Northern Europe, surrounded by the massive Theodosian walls that had kept it safe for centuries, decorated with the accumulated artistic treasures of the Roman and early Byzantine world, and bustling with a commercial life that connected the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Silk Roads of Central Asia, and the northern river routes into a single integrated trading system. The Norse Rus made their first major attack on Constantinople in 860 CE, a raid that took the Byzantines completely by surprise and shocked the city into an awareness of this new threat from the north. Subsequent raids followed, but so did negotiations, and the relationship between the Rus state and Byzantium eventually evolved into one of the most important bilateral relationships of the early medieval world. Trade treaties between the Rus and the Byzantine Empire, texts of which survive in the primary chronicle, regulated the terms under which Rus merchants could operate in Constantinople, the goods they could trade, the weights and measures they must use, and the legal treatment they were entitled to receive. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II sealed a particularly important alliance with the Rus ruler Vladimir I of Kiev in 988 CE in a transaction that had enormous consequences. In exchange for military assistance, 6,000 Norse-Rus warriors to help Basil suppress a dangerous rebellion, Basil offered Vladimir his sister Anna in marriage, along with the expectation that Vladimir would convert to Christianity. Vladimir accepted, was baptized, and proceeded to Christianize his entire domain, ordering the destruction of pagan idols and the baptism of his subjects in the river Dnieper. This conversion of the Rus to Byzantine Christianity, rather than to the Roman Christianity of Western Europe, was a historical fork in the road of incalculable consequence. It aligned Russia permanently with the Orthodox tradition, gave Russian Christianity its distinctive Byzantine character, and set the course for a religious and cultural trajectory that continues to shape Russian civilization today. The Varangian Guard, the Norse mercenary unit that served the Byzantine emperors, was the product of this same relationship. The Guard was formally established by Basil II, using the warriors Vladimir had provided, and it evolved into an elite military institution of the Byzantine state. The Varangians were valued not only for their fighting ability, but for their political reliability. As foreigners with no stake in Byzantine dynastic politics, they could be trusted in situations where units composed of Byzantine subjects might be swayed by factional loyalties. Guard membership became a prestigious and lucrative career for ambitious Norse and later Anglo-Saxon mercenaries, and the rune inscriptions in the Hagia Sophia, casual graffiti scratched into the marble by bored Varangian guardsmen over the centuries, are among the most evocative physical traces of the Norse presence in the eastern Mediterranean world. Norse mythology, a deeper look. The mythological world of the Norse is one of the most richly imagined cosmologies in human religious history, and it rewards extended exploration with a kind of pleasure that is both intellectual and aesthetic. The Norse did not simply invent a set of gods and some stories about them. They created an entire universe, with a cosmology, a history, a geography, a cast of divine and semi-divine beings, a set of ethical principles embedded in myth, and a vision of time and fate that was coherent, internally consistent, and of considerable philosophical depth. The universe of Norse myth is organized around Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash of cosmic proportions whose roots reach down into 3 different worlds and whose branches extend up into the heavens. This is not merely a metaphor. In the Norse mythological system, Yggdrasil is a literal cosmic tree, a structural element of the universe, the axis around which everything turns. 3 roots anchor it. One reaches into Asgard, the realm of the gods, where the Norns dwell at the well of Yrda and weave the fates of all things. One reaches into Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, where the Yell of Mimir holds the water of cosmic wisdom and knowledge, the well from which Odin sacrificed his eye for a drink. One reaches into Niflheim, the realm of primordial cold and mist, where the well Vergelmir is the source of all the rivers of the world. Yggdrasil itself is both eternal and perpetually suffering, A dragon or serpent called Nidugga gnaws at its roots from below. 4 stags roam its branches eating its foliage. The squirrel Ratatoska runs up and down the trunk carrying insulting messages between Nidugga below and an eagle perched at the top. An unnamed hawk sits between the eagle's eyes. Bees and other creatures inhabit its bark and branches. The tree is somehow constantly dying and somehow constantly sustained, nourished by the waters of the sacred wells that the Norns carry up and pour over its roots each day. It is a vision of cosmic existence as a state of perpetual struggle between forces of life and death, creation and dissolution, that is deeply characteristic of the Norse mythological imagination. The 9 worlds of Norse cosmology are contained within or around Yggdrasil: Asgard, the home of the Aesir gods; Vanaheim, the home of the Vanir gods; Alfheim, the home of the Light Elves; Midgard, the home of humanity; Jotunheim, the home of the giants; Svartalfheim or Nidavellir, the home of the dwarves; Niflheim, the realm of cold and death; Muspelheim, the realm of fire; and Helheim, the realm of the dead. These 9 worlds are interconnected in ways that the myths explore repeatedly. The gods travel to Jotunheim to deal with the giants. The dwarves make gifts for the gods in their underground forges. Human heroes sometimes journey to other worlds in search of wisdom or lost companions. The relationship between the gods, the Aesir, and the giants, the Jotnar, is one of the central dynamics of Norse mythology, and it is considerably more complex than a simple opposition between good and evil. The giants are not simply villains, they are the oldest powers in the universe, predating the gods, and the gods themselves are descended from giants on various sides. Odin's mother was a giantess. Thor married a giantess. Loki was a giant, not technically a god at all, though he was Odin's blood brother and lived among the gods. Many of the greatest gifts that the gods possessed came from the giants, or from the dwarves who lived beneath the earth. The wisdom of Mimir, the mead of poetry, the treasure gifts that the dwarves made for the Aesir. The relationship between gods and giants was characterized by alternating conflict, negotiation, alliance, and betrayal, in a dynamic that resembled nothing so much as the complicated relationships between competing human political factions. Loki deserves particular attention because he is one of the most psychologically complex figures in Norse mythology, and his story traces one of the most interesting narrative arcs in the entire mythological system. Loki, a shapeshifter of protean ability, capable of assuming the forms of flies and fish and horses and women, was the companion of the gods and simultaneously their greatest threat. His cleverness was both asset and liability. He used his wits to help the gods solve problems that brute force could not solve, and he used those same wits to create the problems in the first place. He was responsible for the death of the beloved god Balder, the most terrible loss the gods experienced before Ragnarök, through a combination of manipulative cleverness and casual cruelty, and for that he was eventually captured, bound beneath a rock in a cave, with serpent venom dripping onto his face for eternity, while his faithful wife Sigyn held a bowl to catch the venom and spare him the worst of the pain. When the bowl filled, and she turned away to empty it, the drops of venom that fell on Loki caused him to writhe in agony, and his writhing, the myth said, was the cause of earthquakes. Loki's role in Norse mythology has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate. Some scholars see him as a trickster figure in the tradition of trickster gods found in many mythological systems worldwide, a liminal figure who operates between categories, who violates social norms and thereby tests and defines them, who brings both gifts and catastrophe. Others see his evolution from a somewhat ambiguous trickster into a straightforwardly malevolent figure as reflecting either a Christian influence on the recording of the myths or a genuine development in Norse religious thought during the Viking Age. The question of whether Loki was worshipped or propitiated, whether he was a cult figure as well as a literary and mythological one, is unresolved. There is no clear evidence of Loki worship comparable to the evidence for the worship of Odin, Thor, and Freya. The creation myth of Norse cosmology is preserved most completely in the Prose Edda and in the Völuspá, and it begins in a way that is both strange and somehow deeply satisfying, with a void. In the beginning, there was Ginnungagap, the primordial emptiness, the void before existence. To the north of this void was Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist and cold, where 11 rivers called the Elivagar had their source and flowed out into the void. To the south was Muspelheim, the realm of fire and heat and light. The streams from Niflheim flowed into Ginnungagap and froze, layer upon layer, building up an immense expanse of ice. The warmth from Muspelheim reached across the void and began to melt the ice, and from the melting ice emerged the first being, Ymir, the primordial frost giant. From Ymir's body, from his sweat, from the friction of his limbs as he slept, came the first other beings, a man and a woman from beneath his armpit, and a 6-headed frost giant from his feet. From the melting ice also emerged the primordial cow Audumla, who fed Ymir with her milk. Audumla herself fed by licking the blocks of salty ice, and as she licked, a shape began to emerge, first hair, then a head, then a whole figure, the god Buri, the first of the Aesir. Buri had a son named Bor, who married a giantess named Bestla, and their sons were Odin and his brothers Vili and Ve. These 3 gods killed Ymir, and from his body they made the world. His flesh became the earth, his blood the seas, his bones the mountains, his teeth the stones, his skull the dome of the sky, his brain the clouds. The creation of the world in Norse cosmology was an act of violence against a primordial being, a violence that was also an act of creation, the fundamental raw material of existence transformed into the ordered structure of the cosmos. This story of the creation of humanity is equally arresting. Odin and his brothers were walking by the sea when they found 2 trees, an ash and an elm, lying on the land. They raised the trees upright and gave them life. From Odin came breath and life. From Vili came consciousness and movement. From Ve came senses and the ability to speak. The ash tree became the first man, Asker. The elm tree became the first woman, Embla. And from this couple descended all humanity, shaped from trees by divine breath, brought to consciousness by the will of gods who were themselves shaped from the melting of primordial ice. The eschatological vision of Norse mythology, the story of Ragnarök, is in many ways its most remarkable creation, because it insists on the mortality not just of individual beings, but of the entire cosmic order. Everything will end. The gods will die. The world will be destroyed. And this is not a tragedy to be mourned or a catastrophe to be avoided. It is the fate that has been woven by the Norns, the destiny that even the gods cannot escape, and the appropriate response is not despair but the fullest possible engagement with the time that remains. The sequence of events at Ragnarök begins with Fimbulwinter, 3 years of terrible winter, with no summer between them, the sun providing no warmth, and the earth yielding no food, violence and war spreading throughout the human world as the social bonds that hold civilization together begin to fray and break. Then the cosmic constraints begin to loosen. The wolf Fenrir breaks free from the chains that the gods have bound him with. The world serpent Jörmungandr rises from the ocean. The ship Naglfar, made from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, sets sail carrying an army of giants and dead men. Loki escapes from his underground captivity and joins the forces ranged against the gods. The fire giants of Muspelheim, led by Surtur with his flaming sword, move against Asgard. The final battle is a series of duels. Thor kills Jörmungandr but staggers 9 paces and dies from the serpent's venom. Odin is swallowed by Fenrir, and then Fenrir is killed by Odin's son Vidar, who tears the wolf's jaws apart or drives his great boot, made from all the leather scraps ever cut from shoes, into the wolf's lower jaw and spears through the back of its throat. Tyr and the guard dog of Hel, Garma, kill each other. Freyr fights the fire giant Surtur without his magic sword. He gave it away and is killed. Loki and the god Heimdall, long-time enemies, kill each other. Surtur flings fire across the world, burning everything. The earth sinks into the sea, and then the new world. The earth rises from the sea again, fresh and green, the fields growing without seed. The surviving gods, the sons of the slain, Thor's sons Modi and Magni, Odin's sons Vidar and Vali, Hörnir, Balder returned from death, Hörder, meet again on the plain of Idavöla. They find in the grass the golden gaming pieces that the gods had played with before, in the golden age of the beginning, and a new sun rides across the sky, the daughter of the old sun who had given birth to her before her destruction. And in the woods a man and a woman emerge, Leif and Lifthrasir, life and eager for life, who had hidden in the world tree and survived the destruction. From them will come a new human race, in a world reborn and renewed. There is in this myth a generosity of vision that sometimes surprises people encountering Norse mythology for the first time. The world ends, yes, but it begins again. The gods die, but their sons survive. Humanity is destroyed, but 2 people hidden in the tree endure to begin again. The Norse mythological system finds room, even within its tragic framework of inevitable doom, for the persistence of life and the possibility of renewal. It is a vision that takes seriously the reality of death and destruction, while refusing to let those realities have the final word. The legacy in place, names and language. One of the most immediate and tangible ways to encounter the Norse legacy is through place names, the names that Norse settlers gave to the landscapes they occupied, names that have persisted for more than 1,000 years, and that continue to shape how we understand and navigate the world. In England, the density of Norse place names in the areas of heaviest Norse settlement is remarkable. The suffix by, meaning farm or settlement in Old Norse, appears in hundreds of English place names: Derby, Whitby, Grimsby, Rugby, Selby, Kirkby, Crosby. The suffix thorpe, meaning secondary settlement or hamlet, appears in Scunthorpe, Cleethorpes, Althorpe. The suffix thwaite, meaning a clearing in the forest, appears across northern England: Braithwaite, Slaithwaite, Crosthwaite. The suffix toft, meaning a homestead, appears in Lowestoft, Langtoft, Nortoft. The element wick or wick, from Old Norse vik, meaning inlet or bay, gives us Berwick, Anwick, Gatwick, and contributed to the name of the country that was once under strong Norse influence, Chiswick, Norwich, which became Norwich. The Norse element ness, from Old Norse ness, a promontory or headland, appears in Skegness, Dungeness, Sheerness, Caithness. The element fell, from Old Norse fjell, mountain, appears across the hill country of northern England: Scaffell, Winfell, Bowfell. The element beck, from Old Norse becca, stream, is ubiquitous in Yorkshire and the Lake District: Troutbeck, Holbeck, Milbeck. In Scotland, the Norse influence is equally visible in place names, particularly in the Northern Islands and the western coast where Norse settlement was heaviest. The Orkney Islands take their name from the Norse Orkney jar, Seal Islands. The Shetland Islands derive their name from the Norse Hjaltland. Caithness, the northern county of mainland Scotland, contains the Norse element ness. Sutherland, the Suderland, the southern land, was named by the Norse who occupied the northern islands, and for whom the mainland to the south was indeed the southern land, however far north it appears to anyone approaching from England. In Ireland, the Norse foundations of the major port cities left their mark in place names and in the very urban geography of modern Irish cities. The city of Waterford, from the Norse Vedrafjörður, or Ram's Fjord, preserves its Norse name unchanged after 11 centuries. Wexford is from the Norse Vesafjörður. Wicklow is from the Norse Vikingalo, or Viking's Meadow. The town of Arklow is from the Norse Arnkell's Meadow. Dublin itself, known in Irish as Bailey Atha Cliath, the town of the Hurdle Ford, also had a Norse name, Dublin, the Dark Pool, which gave rise to the English version of the name that has persisted to the present day. In Normandy, Norse place names survive in modified French form. Barfleur is from the Norse Barba Floy. Cherbourg contains the Norse Borg, fortress. Dieppe may derive from the Norse Djupa, deep. The river Epte, which formed the boundary of the original Norse grant to Rollo, takes its name from the Norse word for a stream. The landscape of Normandy today is in some sense a palimpsest of Norse presence, visible in the place names if you know how to read them. The Norse linguistic influence on English extends far beyond the place names. Old Norse and Old English were both North Germanic languages, descended from the same Proto-Germanic ancestor, and were probably mutually intelligible to at least some degree, especially in their more basic everyday vocabulary. This mutual intelligibility made the borrowing of Norse words into English easier and more natural than the borrowing that happened when English later encountered the very different French language of the Normans. The Norse contributions to English vocabulary cluster in certain revealing categories. The words for body parts borrowed from Old Norse include skin, skull, keel, as in the keel of the breastbone, nag, an older word for horse. Norse contributed the basic third-person plural pronouns they, them, their, replacing the Old English forms that have otherwise entirely vanished. Norse contributed verbs of basic action, get, give, take, want, call, cast, cut, die, lift, raise, rid, scare, scrub, seam, skip, thrive, trust, bask, gape, glitter, kindle, lurk, ransack, snarl, sprint, whirl. Norse contributed adjectives that are now among the most basic in English: awkward, flat, happy, ill, low, meek, odd, rotten, scant, weak, wrong. The Norse influence on English is not merely a matter of borrowed words but of grammatical simplification. Old English was a highly inflected language. Nouns and adjectives changed their form depending on their grammatical function in the sentence, with different endings for nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive cases. Contact with Old Norse, a language with a similar but not identical inflectional system, appears to have accelerated the erosion of these case endings in English, as speakers of both languages in contact communities simplified toward the forms they shared and dropped the forms that were distinctive to each. The result was the beginning of the process by which English evolved from a highly inflected language like Latin or modern German toward the relatively uninflected, word-order-dependent language it is today. Norse contact was not the only factor in this evolution, but it was a significant contributing one. Norse food and feasting. The feasts of the Norse world, the great gatherings at which food and drink were shared, Speeches were made, poems were recited, alliances were confirmed, and the bonds of community were renewed, were among the most socially important events in Norse life, and they deserve extended description as a window into the texture of daily and ceremonial existence. The Great Hall, the Mead Hall of the heroic poetry, the Skali of the sagas, was the venue for the most important feasts, and the relationship between a lord and his followers was expressed and reinforced through the feast. The lord who could provide abundantly for his people, who could kill cattle and roast them, who could keep the ale horn circulating, who could distribute gifts to his warriors at the feast table, was demonstrating not just his wealth, but his generosity. And generosity was one of the most highly valued qualities in Norse culture. The word for a niggardly lord, a man who hoarded rather than sharing, was one of the worst things you could call a person of authority in the Norse world. The preparation of food for a great feast required enormous organisation and labour. Cattle and sheep would be slaughtered days before, the carcasses hung to age, then butchered and prepared in various ways, roasted on spits over the great fire, boiled in large iron cauldrons, made into stews thickened with grain. Bread would be baked in quantity, flat breads on iron griddles over the fire, and leavened breads if yeast was available, baked in clay or iron pots with embers piled around and above them. Fish might be baked, grilled, or poached. Dairy products, cheese, skyr, a strained yogurt product similar to modern skyr still made in Iceland today, butter, would be brought up from storage. Whatever vegetables were in season or had been preserved, dried peas, dried beans, pickled cabbage, preserved turnips, would appear in the stews and porridges. The ale that flowed at Norse feasts was brewed from grain, primarily barley, malted and then fermented with yeast. Norse ale was not quite the same as modern beer. It was less standardized, more variable in strength and flavour, often flavoured with herbs and roots rather than hops, which were not widely used in Scandinavia until the later medieval period. Some Norse brewing used spruce tips, yarrow, bog myrtle, juniper, and other native plants to flavour and preserve the ale. The resulting beverage was probably considerably stronger and more complex in flavour than the standard commercial ales of today, and it was consumed in large quantities at feasts. Mead, fermented honey and water, was the prestige drink of Norse feasting, the drink of heroes and of the gods themselves. The myth of the mead of poetry describes mead as the source of poetic inspiration and wisdom. The god Kvasir was made from the combined saliva of the Aesir and Vanir gods at the end of the great war between them, and he was a being of such wisdom that he could answer any question. He was killed by two dwarves, who mixed his blood with honey and fermented it into a mead that conveyed wisdom and poetic ability on whoever drank it. This sacred mead was eventually recovered by Odin, who kept it in Asgard and dispensed it to the Skalds who were his favourites on Earth, which is why, in Norse cultural imagination, the gift of poetic ability was understood as a divine gift, literally a substance that the god of poetry and wisdom had given to specially chosen humans. The feast also had its ceremonial dimensions beyond the mere consumption of food and drink. The sacrifice, blot, that often preceded or accompanied a great feast involved the offering of animals to the gods, with the blood of the sacrificed animals sprinkled on the participants and on the cult images of the gods, and the meat then cooked and eaten communally. The ritual context of the feast meal, the meat consecrated to Thor or Freya or Odin, the ale drunk with formal toast to the gods and to the memory of named ancestors, made the act of eating and drinking a religious as well as a social one. The community assembled around the fire, and the cauldron was not merely sharing food, it was participating in a ritual affirmation of its relationship with the divine and with the dead. The toasts, the mini, were a particularly important element of the ceremonial feast. Toasts were drunk to Odin for victory, to Njord and Freyr for good harvests and peace, to the memory of the king who had just died, to the memory of named ancestors, to the assembled company. Each toast was accompanied by the drinking of a full horn, the drinking horn that was passed around the company, each person taking their turn, and the refusal of a toast or the failure to drink fully was a social offence. The ceremonial significance of the drinking horn was such that fine examples were made with elaborate silver mountings and kept as treasured objects. The great silver-mounted aurochs horns found in the Sutton Hoo treasure in England, though from an Anglo-Saxon context, give some sense of how important these objects could be as prestige items. The skald's performance at the feast was another essential element. The poet who composed and recited elaborate verse in praise of the Lord and the assembled warriors, who preserved the reputation of the community in the most durable form available to a pre-literate or semi-literate culture, the form of memorable verse that could be transmitted orally across generations. The skald was not merely an entertainer but a kind of cultural record keeper, and the relationship between the skald and his patron was one of genuine mutual benefit. The Lord provided the poet with food, shelter, gifts, and security. The poet provided the Lord with what the Norse most valued as a form of immortality, the reputation that outlived the body. And so, as the night continues on its deep and quiet course, and as the sound of the imagined sea breathes on at the edges of everything, we find ourselves coming toward the end of this long, unhurried journey through the Viking world. Not the end exactly. There is always more, always another fjord to sail into, another saga chapter to open, another rune stone to read. But the end of this particular evening's wandering through a world that was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable chapters in the long story of human civilization. What remains, as the fire burns lower and the last of the evening's reflections settle into the warm darkness, is not the image of the horned helmet or the burning monastery, those dramatic fictions that popular culture has substituted for the richer truth. What remains is something more complex and more human. The farmer in his longhouse, watching the weather with the particular attention of someone whose life depends on reading it correctly. The woman at her loom, weaving cloth that will eventually become a sail, her labour essential to every voyage that her community undertakes. The skald, composing verse in his head as he walks, turning the day's events into the metrical patterns that will preserve them for generations. The explorer, lying awake in the bow of his longship as it crosses open ocean toward a coast that no one in his family has ever seen, feeling the particular mixture of fear and elation that attends every genuine reaching beyond the known. The real legacy of the Viking Age is not the violence, though the violence was real and its consequences were lasting. It is the extraordinary combination of practical skill and imaginative ambition that defined Norse civilization at its best. The ability to build a ship that could cross the North Atlantic, the ability to compose poetry of genuine sophistication, the ability to establish legal institutions that embodied sophisticated ideas about justice and representation, the ability to navigate by stars and birds and wave patterns to places that the rest of the world had never heard of. It is also, perhaps most importantly, the reminder that the categories through which we understand history, civilized and barbaric, aggressive and peaceful, primitive and sophisticated, are never as simple or as stable as we would like them to be. The Norse were none of those things cleanly. They were farmers who raided and raiders who farmed, traders who enslaved and explorers who marvelled. They were poets who celebrated violence and lawmakers who constrained it. They were pagans who converted and converts, who preserved the pagan myths in careful literary form. They were people navigating the particular complications of their particular moment in history, just as we navigate ours. The study of the past is, at its deepest, the study of the full range of human possibility, the full spectrum of what people have done and been and believed and built and destroyed and remade. The Norse add to that spectrum a colour that is entirely their own, cold and bright, like the light that falls on a northern sea on a clear autumn morning, when the air is so clean that you can see forever, and the horizon is a sharp line between two different kinds of blue.